Welcome to the 2026 History Expo and our celebration of the American Semi-Quincentennial, America 250. We're going to start out with the Chautauqua Lake Memorial Post 8647, VFW, who will present arms. And then we will have the Pledge of Allegiance done by John Sipos.
There's two. Right shoulder up. Forward up. Left. Go left. Go left. Power left. Go left. 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 Right. Go left. Go left. Go left, power left, detail, hold, left, face, present, arms.
Need you. Since this is a historical event, I'm going to give you a little history on the Pledge of Allegiance. The Pledge of Allegiance was written in the year 1892 to mark the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus landing on this continent. He wasn't the first. I have to tell you, it was a Swedish person named Leif Erikson who landed here about the year 1000. But I wasn't here, so I don't know exactly. But anyway, the Pledge of Allegiance was written in 1892, and it was 26 words in length. And it was said by millions of school children on October 12th at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in 1892. Since then, more words have been added to the Pledge of Allegiance. One of them is a phrase that goes, "One nation under God," taken from one of President Lincoln's speeches. President Eisenhower added that in 1954. Probably a lot of you weren't even alive then, but I was in 4th grade at that time. But anyway, remember, it is one nation under God. There is no pause in one nation under God. So follow me, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. You may be seated.
Thank you, John, and thank you, gentlemen. At this point, I'm delighted to be able to present the Jamestown Harmony Express, who have come recently from Washington, D.C., where they participated on July 4th in the opening of the national celebration of America 250. Gentlemen, we're glad to have you here.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bumpers in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Well, thank you, Post 8647, and thank you, Jamestown Harmony Express. We have a full schedule today. Our next event in this room is going to be my talk at 10:45 on Chautauqua County's connections to the American Revolution, and I'm sure you will find out some things you didn't know. And at 11:45, we're having Traci Langworthy, who will be talking about Chautauqua County in the War of 1812. There are several mentions of events in our history books that don't quite agree, and Traci has done a wonderful job of sorting those out. At 12:45, we have Paul Fardink doing his program on the Revolutionary War veterans who later moved and settled and were buried in Chautauqua County, and a fascinating, well-done program this is. And it also highlights the program that's going on right now of marking the graves with historical markers, marking the graves where for the cemeteries where these men lie. And at 1:45, Rhonda Hoffman from the Grosvenor Room of the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library will be down here. She is one of the leading genealogists in Western New York, and she does a superb job at telling you how to find your Revolutionary War ancestors. At 2:45, the history teacher of the year will be presented with an award by the DAR. And at 3:45, I'll have some closing remarks. And 4 o'clock ends the day, and there's plenty of time, but there's plenty to do in between. And you can really enjoy it and learn a lot today. Thank you so much for coming out and coming to this little ceremony. I'm Norman Carlson. I'm the Chautauqua County Historian and the chairman of the committee organizing the 2026 History Expo, America 250. And my talk this morning is going to be about Chautauqua County's connections to the Revolutionary War. Chautauqua County is, obstructing my view there, Chautauqua County is 350 miles west of Boston, Massachusetts, on the Atlantic coast, where the Revolutionary War began. We're also 450 miles east of Dubuque, Illinois, on the bank of the Mississippi River, and Dubuque is 350 miles due north of Kaskaskia, where the most westerly military event of the Revolution took place. So thinking in terms of what statisticians call the median, Chautauqua County was nearly in the middle of the fighting in the Revolutionary War. Now, no one but me has ever thought about it that way. Let's see here. Oh. There you go. That shows what I'm talking about. No one has ever thought about it that way but me, and the conventional view is that no battles were fought here, and we were beyond the frontier, and no settlers and very few Indians lived here. So we have no direct local relevance to the war. But I think I still have a point, and now, of course, is my time to say so. But of course, no one questions the significance of the 366 Revolutionary War veterans buried in the soil of Chautauqua County. Chautauqua County is unusually well favored in knowledge and awareness of the lives and sacrifices of these men, thanks largely to the work of the late Frederick W. Cates. Cates got a head start from the ladies of the local Daughters of the American Revolution, local chapters under the leadership of Mrs. Lucy Norton Shanklin back in 1925. But their successors, under the leadership of Virginia Barden, the late Virginia Barden, continued to work after Kate's death. And I can think of no better way to celebrate our semi-quincentennial than to spend a few hours reading Kate's book. It's really excellently done and excellently written, entertainingly so, I might add. In recent years, our local Sons of the American Revolution chapter, in a project headed by Paul Fardink, who is the second speaker to follow me today, has been vigorously engaged. Did I inadvertently touch this thing? Has been vigorously engaged in erecting historical markers, there we go, at the cemeteries where these men are buried, and there are most of the cemeteries in the county, actually, where the marker Paul Fardink has been vigorously engaged in erecting historical markers at the cemeteries where these men lie. Money for this venture has been provided by the Pomeroy Foundation of Syracuse. Okay, on December 9th, on December 19th, 1775, the simmering tensions between residents of Great Britain's American colonies and the King's government erupted into outright warfare at Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. These were the first battles of the Revolutionary War. Joseph Garfield was born in April 1780 while the war was going on. That was in Sutton, Massachusetts. He was the fourth of the 5 children of Eliakim Garfield, who was a Revolutionary soldier at the time he was born, at the time that Joseph was born. After the war, father and son moved to Stratton, Vermont, near Wardsboro, from which so many of our early families of the South Central and Southeast Chautauqua County came later. Later, Eliakim moved to Saratoga County, New York. I want to go back to that. Go back to the handwritten book there. No, we're going backwards. We want to go forward. This doesn't seem to work. There we go. There we go. All right. Later, as I said, Eliakim moved to Saratoga County, New York, where he died, and Joseph, after spending about 4 years in Pine Grove, Pennsylvania, moved to Bustye around 1820. In 1955, John Bergeson of Lander, Pennsylvania, gave the late Rupert Laux a small leather-bound notebook that had been used by Eliakim between 1771 and 1797, encompassing the entire span of the Revolutionary War, plus the subsequent 14 years. It's just like the little notebook that I carry, in 2012, Laux donated the little book to the Fenton History Center, and on the last page of this old but otherwise unexceptional item, in small handwriting and bad spelling, I discovered a note. Now we can go down to the transcription of it here. This day, April the 19th, 1775, the King's troops come to Concord, and being made very unwelcome, returned home with great speed and much loss. It is a contemporary record of the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, written down by then 42-year-old Eliakim Garfield about 45 miles to the southwest of the action. 155 years of the little book's history is unknown, but its arrival at Fenton was a once-in-a-lifetime thrill, the greatest in my career. In the Barker Museum in Fredonia, there is a Revolutionary War document. There we go. Military orders from Bennington, Vermont, Town Clerk Colonel Moses Robinson to Captain Ebenezer Willoughby, dated June 30th, 1776. Captain Willoughby is ordered to call your company together forthwith to enlist men for an immediate march to the help of the frontier settlements on the New Hampshire grants, with 2 weeks' provisions and to be under the command of Colonel Seth Warner. He says further that there is to be 90 men enlisted out of Shaftesbury. Okay. And here is next slide is a list of items, Revolutionary connection. There we go. At the McClurg Museum in Westfield. And you can read that. And, I should have mentioned that document there at Barker was donated by the great-granddaughter of Captain Ebenezer in 1976. All right, this is the items in the McClurg Museum. Now, there have been, and yet may be in private hands, other memories, other mementos of the, I gotta quit holding this thing, it keeps clicking for the other mementos of the Revolutionary War, laboriously and reverently brought by ox cart and saddlebag into this area by settlers and pioneer families. From the old settlers' reunions of the 1870s to the 1927 Jamestown Centennial, various historical gatherings and commemorations have featured displays of antiques and artifacts preserved in families when there were no museums in Chautauqua County. And it would make a grand project for someone to comb the records and make a list of them and try to determine if any of those heirlooms of the Revolution still exist in private hands and could be relocated. Okay, here I get to some more direct connections. Most of the Declaration of Independence is taken up by what is essentially a bill of particulars, complaints about acts of King George and the British government that infringed on the rights of the colonists. The 20th out of the 27 complaints reads as follows: for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and changing the boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies. The neighboring province that it's talking about was Quebec. It was enlarged in 1774 by the Quebec Act, well after the British had won the French and Indian War and took control of all the formerly French colony of New France or Canada. The boundaries of the old French territory were expanded dramatically. Reading from the original Quebec Act publication, part of the boundary runs, quote, along by the eastern and southeastern bank of Lake Erie, following the said bank until the same shall be intersected by the northern boundary granted by the charter of the province of Pennsylvania. Now, what that says is that the boundary of Quebec, as it existed in 1776, was at the Lake Erie shoreline. Chautauqua County, as legally defined and described today, extends out to the present international boundary halfway between the United States and Canada, right down the middle of Lake Erie, where we border on Haldimand and Welland counties, Ontario. So today you can march out at Dunkirk or Lake Erie State Park or Barcelona, the beach there, and wade into territory that was part of Quebec and thus part of one of the talking points of contention actually mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. All right, next subject. George Washington's strategy in the Revolutionary War was basically defensive. Now, this is an against the odds way to win a war, but it can be done. There were exceptions to this defensive approach, however, and one was the Sullivan-Clinton Broadhead campaign against the Iroquois in 1779. This was probably the most carefully and exhaustively planned of those few offensive campaigns of the war, and it was George Washington's baby right down the line. Alexander Flick, the famed New York State historian, in 1929 at the sesquicentennial, of the campaign, advanced the idea that the Sullivan-Clinton campaign, along with George Rogers Clark's conquest of the Illinois country, were crucial in securing the Western territories to the U.S. in the peace negotiations following the war. He further suggested that Washington acted with foresight in that regard. However, Joseph R. Fisher in 1997 and other recent historians have poo-pooed that idea. Fisher claims that the U.S. success at the negotiations is attributable mainly to the British opinion that the West was of little value. Furthermore, Washington left no recorded statement to suggest a Grand Western strategy. But be that as it may, in 1794, Canadian Governor John Graves Simcoe made a bizarre, brief, blustering attempt to roll back the New York settlement frontier to the, quote, the old French line. And he also advocated making the West into some form of Indian buffer state, all of which makes one wonder what might have happened if there had been no Sullivan campaign and the Iroquois had remained entrenched in their primeval homeland in the Finger Lakes country. Well, plans for the New York Indian Campaign formed in 1778. The British armies of St. Leger and Burgoyne had been defeated in New York in 1775. Now, that has been called the turning point of the war, but it actually only brought the war to a stalemate. In 1778, the dramatic Wyoming and Cherry Valley massacres by Indians and Tories made it imperative that something be done about the Iroquois. Meanwhile, down at Fort Pitt, plans and campaigns against Detroit or Niagara were annual events. That's plans, not actions. By the late 1770s, most of the Indian raids that against the frontier were no longer coming from the Shawnee, Delaware, and Wyandots of northwestern Ohio. Now they originated with the Munsees and Senecas of French Creek and the Upper Allegheny. This happened largely because of American diplomatic bungling and stupid brutalities committed by the frontiersmen and untrained militiamen. This had alienated neutral and friendly communities, initially neutral and friendly Indian communities. And in response to this, the main depot of British support and supply for the Indian raids shifted from Detroit to Fort Niagara. Colonel Mason Bolton, the commander at Niagara, placed Lieutenant John Dockstetter of the Indian Department at Buckaloons, which was Irving, Pennsylvania, in 1778, and at Cattaraugus Creek in 1779. The main thrust of the American attack in this campaign under General John Sullivan came up the Susquehanna River from Easton, Pennsylvania, and General James Clinton's forces gathered at Canajoharie on the Mohawk and came down and joined Sullivan at Tioga, Pennsylvania, just below the state line on August 22nd. The combined forces, about 6,000 men, some women and children followed part way, essentially followed the great warrior's path to the Iroquois heartland as far west as the Genesee River. They reached their farthest west point September 14th. Colonel Daniel Broadhead at Fort Pitt came up the Allegheny from August 11th to September 14th with 605 men, plus officers and 8 Delaware Indians, to attack the villages near the state line and on French Creek. All that cost $6,000, and the whole campaign cost $900,000. Now I'm going to tell you how Chautauqua County fits into this. Early in 1779, George Washington, Colonel Daniel Broadhead, Generals Edward Hand and Philip Schuyler, and Colonel William Patterson, and others on the Continental Army staff had gathered all the information they could about the routes into and through the Iroquois heartland as far as Niagara. Following some less formal inquiries and meetings, Washington sent out 2 formal questionnaires. The first containing 19 questions. I'm ahead of myself on the slides there. If you can back, that's you go. Following some less formal inquiries, Washington sent out 2 formal questionnaires. The first contained 19 questions and was sent to General Hand, Colonels Cox and Peterson, and Colonel Charles Stewart. The focus was on the Susquehanna drainage and routes north and northwest from it. But a little information did come in about the Upper Allegheny, especially from General Hand. He even found a few informants that drew rough maps. If we go back one, we'll see one of those maps. There we go. He even found a few individuals who drew rough maps, but the only one that has survived shows little more than the mouths of the unnamed Conowongo and the named French Creek. Among the Washington papers in the Library of Congress is the only description of the Upper Allegheny and the portage to the Genesee that I know of from this period, and it's dated May 13th, 1779, and it's in Alexander Hamilton's handwriting. Now, Edward Hand was designated to lead Sullivan's Light Corps, and he had been commander at Fort Pitt from June 1777 to May 1778. So he was as intimately involved in this intelligence effort as an American general could be. 11 out of the 16 questions on Washington's second questionnaire concerned the Upper Allegheny directly or partially. So Washington's interest was now turned toward this general region, and we can safely assume that he carefully examined most of the better maps of the time, including those of Lewis Evans, plus the updated Thomas Pownall version. Let's see the next one here. That's the Thomas Pownall map, and I've blown up Chautauqua Lake there in the lower right-hand corner. That's Chautauqua Lake in 1776. Okay, and he also would have examined the map of Dr. John Marshall from 1755. All 3 of those show a tiny named Chautauqua Lake. Mitchell had complete access to all of the official sources, and these certainly would have included copies of many French maps. Evans worked more directly from field sources and informants. He admitted limited knowledge or outright guesswork for the Allegheny headwaters. What he did know of that river was from numerous traders and an otherwise unknown, very intelligent Indian called the Eagle. Okay, at first there was an intent to join the three armies in the West and crown the campaign with the capture of Fort Niagara. Hence the nature of the questions that Washington asked on that second questionnaire. Washington eventually canceled the Brodhead campaign, but Brodhead followed through on his own initiative. He was a real bulldog. Despite Delaware friends, white deserters from Fort Niagara, and other stray travelers, surprisingly little knowledge about the region above the state line or the location of the later corn planter grant was forthcoming, or at least surprisingly little was located and considered by Washington. This failure of American intelligence is interesting. On the one hand, there must have been white traders, captives, French and Indian War veterans, friendly Indians, etc., who had crossed the Chautauqua route. In November of 1777, while at Fort Pitt, General Hand had sent Simon Girty, let's go up and see him. There we go, had sent Simon Girty who was the Revolutionary War's second best known turncoat. They'd sent him to the present location of Warren, Pennsylvania, where he had obtained detailed information about raids past, present, and future, and about local Indian leadership and allegiance, and captives, etc. The Indians were going to take Girty to Niagara, but he escaped. This was only 5 months before he defected to the British side. Girty was superbly qualified to gather and understand information. He lived at the location of the later corn planter grant as a captive from the ages of 11 to 14, which would be 1756 to 1759. And part of the time he may even have been at Cattaraugus Creek. Even better, in the spring of 1776, George Morgan, the American Indian agent, and General Hand had managed to send a white spy from Fort Pitt to Niagara with a large body of Indians. When he got there, he served as interpreter at a conference with the British. How would that be, to have your spy be the interpreter at the conference? You know, you can't do much better. Now, I told the people at Westfield earlier this year and the people at the Fredonia Opera House, unfortunately, we don't know his exact route or his name. Well, I do know his name now, and it was Paul Long. And I got that information through Robert Emerson at the Western New York Genealogical Society. Brodhead, who replaced McIntosh as commander at Fort Pitt in March 1779, sent out spies and scouts from time to time as far as Meadville and Warren. And he also constantly received information from friendly Delaware Indians in the Ohio country. And he had a small contingent of Delaware volunteers accompanying him on his campaign, as I mentioned above. His top Indian, actually mixed blood guide, was John Montour, who was in a very interesting family that had served Pennsylvania as Indian interpreters and diplomats for 3 centuries. Montour's mother was a Delaware. I'm going off on a tangent here, but I thought this was interesting. His grandmother, known as Madame Montour, may have been the first American woman, or surely the first Indian woman, to demand and get equal pay for equal work. Now that statement is made, it's a little more complicated, but it's pretty much a fact. But despite all this, nobody in Washington's circle seemed to know anything about the upper Allegheny and its tributaries or the route to Niagara, or specifically Chautauqua Lake and Portage. Well, what was going on here was two things. First, after and immediately before the French cut their road at Presque Isle and Le Boeuf, 20-some years previous, the Indians and also any deserters, couriers, traders, captives, or other stray travelers probably favored that route. Secondly, the western branch of the Senecas, called the Chanasios, were keeping travelers off the forbidden path and out of their territory in general. So for whatever reason, the territory of the western Senecas well, the printer just came to an end with my speech there, so I'll have to wing it from here on. The territory of the western Senecas had been keeping people out of western New York, so very little was known about them. Well, all right, in the history books, the one thing that, the old history books from the 19th century and turn of the century, the one thing about the Revolutionary War in Chautauqua County that's played up is the Hannistown raid of July 13th, 1782. It wasn't the last battle of the war, but it was one of the last. And a force of about 300 Indians and British forces came down through Chautauqua Lake and attacked Hannistown, Pennsylvania, east of Pittsburgh on that date, took quite a number of captives, and then came back presumably up through Chautauqua Lake. And there's a few things that modern scholarship has improved upon the old accounts. The old history books say that Gaius Suda was the leader, but he was probably second in command. And Old Smoke, or Sayanquarta, was the Indian leader of that group. And it's interesting, you can actually find the names of these captives. They were taken to Fort Niagara. Some of them were, one of them, I think they're married an officer, and some of them were sent to Quebec. And you can find their pension applications. Well, all right. During the course of the Revolutionary War, the American government operated under the uncertain authority of the Articles of Confederation. Well, they were prepared and put into operation in 1777, but they weren't actually ratified until 1781. Well, what was holding them up? It involved Chautauqua County. Some of the states, such as Massachusetts, Connecticut, Georgia, and North Carolina, and certainly Virginia, had charter claims all the way originally to the Pacific Ocean and not at this point all the way to the Mississippi River, whereas other colonies like Maryland and Rhode Island and Delaware and Pennsylvania even had no such claims. And they refused to sign the Articles of Confederation until the states with Western claims turned them over to the federal government. Well, that didn't happen until March of 1781, when New York State took the lead. Now, New York State was in a unique situation. It did not have charter claims like the others did to the West, but it did have a claim based on their special relationship with the Iroquois, who had conquered vast territories in the 17th century in the Beaver Wars. So to get this thing going, New York came up essentially with 7 arbitrary proposals to cede land in the West. Their furthest hope and claim was all the way out to 10 miles west of Detroit, and their last stand was going to be a meridian 10 miles west of the westernmost bend of the Niagara River or the western end of Lake Ontario, whichever proved to be farther west. Because at that time, nobody knew within 10 or 20 miles where some of these lines would fall. So that essentially is how the western boundary of New York State was set. And of course, that is also the western boundary of Chautauqua County. And it could have turned out to be quite a few miles different one way or the other based on several different points, such as whether they included Burlington Bay in Lake Ontario or not. All right. When the actual line was drawn, which was 1790, 11 years later, Andrew Ellicott and his team of surveyors and their super high-tech equipment, which they had at that, super high-tech for 1790, they had to go up into Canadian territory because when this action was done in 1781, the Congress and the American people in general had hoped that the peace treaty would give us both sides of the Great Lakes and up to 45 degrees north latitude. But it did not. And when we found ourselves in possession of just the south border, we found we had to get British permission to go up on their territory and go up to the end of Lake Ontario. And there's a little story there that happened that I like to tell. Ellicott had all the papers with him, that, all these diplomatic requirements. This is British territory, and the British were still holding Fort Niagara, of course, up until 1794. And he presented Colonel Harris with these papers, and Harris rejected them and said, no, we're going to have to wait for a confirmation from Governor Simcoe of Canada that is coming down on the boat here in a few days. Well, Ellicott said, well, we'll camp here and wait for that. No, he said, you must not do that. I will not let you camp in this neighborhood. And so they ended up 100 miles away and waiting for the papers. Well, anyhow, Ellicott said, I like this one. He said, can my men come across the border to look at the falls from the Canadian side and satisfy their curiosity? No, he said, your men may not view the falls. They may not satisfy their curiosity. Too many people have seen the falls already. Well, all right. One more connection, quirky little thing that I found about Chautauqua County in the Revolutionary War. In 1908, the Grape Belt, a Dunkirk newspaper, published a little piece, and now, of course, without my documents, I don't remember the man's name. He was a car inspector for the Erie Railroad, a bachelor, and he had been digging at the Ripley Indian site. And you have to realize that in those days, the attitudes were very different. They didn't see it as grave robbing. They didn't see it as desecration of archaeological knowledge. In fact, Arthur Parker, the state archaeologist, the previous year had just completed a state-of-the-art professional dig at Ripley, and the publication is still a classic and a landmark in the science. So I suppose the landowner told the guy, yeah, the archaeologists have been here and got all they want, so go ahead. You can. Now, I'm speculating, obviously, but anyhow, he found what is described, they didn't use the term in the paper, but I would call it a medicine bundle. And it was a clay vessel of some kind, and inside were two continental notes, one from 1776 and one from 1778. The paper money that was used during the Revolutionary War. And so what's going on here? That site had not been inhabited by the Indians, so far as we know, for 150 years. And it's highly unlikely that any Indians traveling through Chautauqua County would be particularly aware of the site, and certainly not identifying it as ancestral or sacred or anything. But all I can think of is that some small group, maybe on a mission of diplomacy or trade or something, going between Niagara and Detroit, or maybe even just a group on a family, going on a private or family mission, going through and died. One member died, and they just happened to bury him on this Indian site. But of course, the objects of continental notes are long gone. They're not, to my knowledge, in any museum. But anyhow, that is all that I have about the different connections that Chautauqua County had, that I can have on my half of a note in my memory. And I'll be glad to answer any questions. It's a good time to start answering questions.
Is that the same broadhead that is featured in Jamestown?
The question was, is Colonel Daniel Broadhead any relation to John Broadhead and that family of Jamestown fame? No. They're spelled differently, even. Yeah, and I think Colonel Daniel Broadhead was, second generation Irish immigrant, and the Jamestown Broadheads were Yorkshire. Other questions? I really apologize for not checking to see that every page was here. I must have run out of paper or something when I printed this out, but it just came to an end. Oh, there must be other questions about the Hannistown raid. There's a lot of literature, both modern and early, about that, and it would be possible to find out more about the people that were captives and so on. And as far as that goes, this Paul Long, that was the spy in 1776 there at the conference at Fort Niagara, surely I haven't had time as yet, just recently found this out, but to see if there's if he's in the Patriot indexes for the DAR, if he's in the pension records, if his report is on file somewhere, or if anything's known about his family, or did he apply for a pension? Be some wonderful material that we could find there. Yes, question.
For you, which a lot of people, like shortly after the Revolution with the Whiskey Rebellion in Pennsylvania, what part of Pennsylvania did that really take place? Was that more towards Philadelphia?
The question was, what about the Whiskey Rebellion in western Pennsylvania and the connection to the Chautauqua County on that? Well, it did not actually affect up in here. For one reason, there just weren't any. Well, there were a few by this. It took place in the 1790s. Am I correct on that? And by that time, there were very few Indians living in Chautauqua County along the lake and up at Cattaraugus Creek and at Kyantone, some down the river in Warren. There is a book, The Nemesis of Chautauqua, published in 1901 on very poor quality paper. It's online and available now. That has it's an exciting story about actions on Chautauqua Lake in the Whiskey Rebellion. It's fiction. It has fooled a few historians in the past, but it is fiction.
What was the name of it?
The Nemesis of Chautauqua by Richmond. 1901. Any other questions? All right, the next talk here at 11:45 is going to be Traci Langworthy, and she's going to carry that through to the War of 1812. And she'll be more fully documented than I was and have all her papers in hand. And I've heard this talk quite some years ago, and she does a very good job. Oh yeah, that is the location of a skirmish that took place during the Broadhead campaign, and Lieutenant Dockstetter at Cattaraugus Creek set out with 50 men to go down and help, and later Vincent Martonis, after this marker was put up, he has put up a marker there at Cattaraugus Creek, there we go, about that incident as part of the Broadhead campaign. What more am I leaving out? Yeah, Guy Studa, I mentioned him. And that is Andrew Ellicott. And there, okay, now we're going to find out. Can I read the name? John Curry. John Curry was the fellow that found the Continental notes. And those aren't the ones, of course, but that's what they would have looked like. Well, I must have turned it off. Thank you for coming this morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is our second speech of the morning for the 2006 History Expo. And we have Traci Langworthy, who is currently Interim Vice President of Academic Affairs at Jamestown Community College, where she teaches courses in American history and women's history. And her talk is going to be about Chautauqua County in the War of 1812. Traci?
Thank you, Mr. Carlson. And thank you to all of you for coming. This is such a nice turnout. I was remembering as I was running down to the bathroom just now that we had the first of these back in 2011, I think it was. Ruth can correct me. When we had the county bicentennial, Chautauqua County was celebrating its 200th anniversary then. And it was just so lovely to see all of the organizations in one place and all of the displays. And there were so many people talking and such great conversations. And then that was done. And I think all of us were thinking, my gosh, I hope we'll do this again sometime. And then there was a long lull, and then it got resurrected last year. And now, Norman, you've done such a great job this year with all the publicity. And yeah, we should give Norman a round of applause. I'll do it away from the mic. Yeah. I've seen all the lawn signs, and I was like, wow, this is a big deal. So exciting. So, I'm doing the War of 1812, which is not one of my usual topics, but one that I find really interesting because the early 1800s is my time period that I'm really the most interested in American history. So this kind of falls into that. And I apologize, I'm going to be reading from my screen to make sure I don't flub up because this isn't normally a talk that I give, but I'm going to start with a story and check my clicker too to make sure working okay. Here we go. So I want you to imagine that we're back in the year 1812 or around the year 1812. And for this story, I want you to imagine, and my screen got ahead of me, I apologize. For this story, I want you to imagine that you are standing on the shore of Lake Erie at Dunkirk at sunset on a summer night, and as you're looking out across the water, your eye notices on the darkening colors of the water in front of you the outline of a small boat approaching from the east. It's a small little boat, probably a local trading vessel that would have been carrying salt or maybe timber back and forth, and that was not uncommon by that day and age, although the settlements were still really sparse along Lake Erie at that point, still in our county, I should say. But you notice something else atypical as you're looking out across the water that gives you pause. You notice that not far behind this little boat approaching from the east, you can just make out the outline of a much larger vessel. And if you lived in that area along the lakeshore at that point in time, you probably would have identified it as a schooner, and you likely would have identified it as a British schooner because the British had a fleet on the lake that was based across the lake in Canada. So this is where our story gets a little interesting. So remember, this is the year 1812, and by the summer of 1812, June 18th to be exact, we were at war with Britain. This is the war declaration. And if you lived back then, you may have also known that at the end of June, shortly after this declaration was announced, as reported in the Buffalo Gazette, a British naval ship had seized another local merchant boat, not unlike our small boat that we're tracking with our eye. And it had been in the newspapers. So now imagine, if you are following along in the story here, let's put ourselves in the shoes of the crew members on our small boat and imagine their worry as they look back and see a British schooner with a line of cannon on deck closing in on them. Clearly they were in some danger and recognized that. They slip into the mouth, or they look ahead and they see the channel of Canadaway Creek is opening in the lake in front of them, just to their west. And they make fast in that direction, and they slip into the mouth of the creek as darkness falls, hoping the British will pass them by. And it works for the time being, but not for long. And here's what the creek mouth looks like during the day, not on an evening scene. So you have to use your imagination here. And as morning breaks, the British vessel is seen at anchor no more than a quarter mile from shore. And now here's where the story gets really interesting. Luckily, we aren't the only folks on shore who've been watching these events unfold. Soon after the war broke out, there was a company of 40-some local militia that were ordered to guard the mouth of the Canadaway. I'll go back to Canadaway Creek here. This is the east bank of the creek, where they would have been informally stationed. They basically kept evening watch, from what I can tell. And more men would soon be on their way to the scene as well because of the quick thinking of a local woman, Mrs. Celia Cole, who lived near the mouth of the creek. And this is a picture of what remained of the Cole family log cabin before it was no more, around 1915. So seeing the schooner out on the lake as daylight breaks, Mrs. Cole had the quick thinking to, and I should mention, she was a widowed mother of 10. She had the quick thinking to mount her horse, and she gallops off towards the settlement we now know as Fredonia to round up some extra help. By the time she returns with more men, the schooner has dispatched a rowboat towards shore with at least a dozen redcoats on board. Now, the militiamen who had positioned themselves behind a sand dune on the east bank, I got a little bit ahead of myself. Go back to our east bank of the creek. You can imagine them kind of hunkering down in here. These militiamen see the rowboat approaching. They wait for the rowboat to get within musket range, and then they aim and they fire. So in the skirmish that follows, 3 redcoats are wounded, but the show of force is enough to compel the British to retreat, and no one on shore suffered even a scratch. Our story ends with Mrs. Cole serving food and drink to all the men assembled, which are now close to 100, and everyone breathing a sigh of relief. So that's our story, our opening story. How many of you have heard this story? Guessing we got a history crowd and a local history crowd, so a lot of you have. If you haven't learned this or heard this story before today, you'll be excited to know that you just learned the story of the first shots of the War of 1812. For many years, that's how this event was remembered locally. And in fact, 50 years ago, when the U.S. was celebrating its bicentennial anniversary in 1976, a group of citizens from the Dunkirk area placed a historical marker near the mouth of Canadaway Creek, where Temple Road comes out on Route 5. And this was to honor the site of the so-called first skirmish. This is what the marker looks like. It's a plaque on a boulder to make sure future generations would not forget. Yeah.
My cousin Helen, she lives right there.
Whoa. So you've seen this boulder up close and personal.
Yes. Right.
Now everyone's going to want to come to your house and take pictures with you there. Well, cool. I'm glad you could be here. Neat. So 50 years later, now we're celebrating our 250th. And I guess you could say that the folks who placed that marker kind of got their wish, because here we are talking about this story, right? But we've got some sorting out to do here now. Lots of sorting out to do. First of all, and I'm going to make it unexciting now, which is every historian's job, right? First of all, the skirmish could not have been the first of the war unless it occurred in early July of that year. And one of our sources suggests that that could have been possible, and I'll tell you about that in a few minutes. But in fact, there's a lot of disagreement between the sources as to the date when this might have occurred. In the first published history of our county, which came out in 1846, that's the title page, was the history by Emery F. Warren, if any of you are familiar with that. The story we just went over was said to have occurred in 1814, which it's 2 years after the war began, so it could not have been the first shots of the war, if that is accurate. That story in 1846 also never mentioned Mrs. Cole getting on her horse and galloping to Fredonia, and it also talked about there being 2 small boats, not 1. So a lot of discrepancies here. So putting aside the question of the date for the moment, one big problem with this story that you're already picking up on is that there are multiple versions of it that have been passed down, and some of them have radically different details. So what do we do with this as historians? Do we throw out the story and write it off as total myth? I actually think there's a lot we can learn from it, and that's what I'm going to talk about more for the rest of my time here. And for starters, if I back up just a little bit, I am a history teacher at JCC, and I'll put this up next. Through the years, I've noticed when I talk with my students that quite a few of them, actually the vast majority of them, really don't remember anything about the War of 1812. And I don't think they're alone. When I first started researching this skirmish, I was talking with a very well-educated friend of mine, I think someone at JCC. Hi, Martha. It wasn't you, though, I don't think. I was talking with someone at JCC, and they said, you know, I'm kind of embarrassed to say, but I don't remember who were we fighting and why. So I have a feeling that a lot of Americans are in that same boat. It tends to be a forgotten war. So if you're in that boat and you can't really remember what it was all about, first we were fighting the British, but also Native Americans who were allied with them. And if I can back up a sec here, I skipped this political cartoon, we might call it, from that era that shows another element here. We were also fighting Native Americans who were allied with the British. And one of our grievances, in fact, was that the British were thought to be inciting violence on the frontier by trading firearms to Native groups. And that's something that the artist of this image was insinuating in the way they have this drawn. But we were also frustrated with the British for other things. They're also causing trouble for us in the Atlantic, owing partly to their war against Napoleon in France. And you see that word impressment there. That was a fancy word for drafting. In essence, they were seizing both our trading vessels and also our men off of our ships on the guise of them being British-born subjects who could be, quote unquote, impressed into the British Navy. So that was a major thing. And then there are also some folks in Congress who were really keen on going to war because they thought it would give us an opportunity to seize some land from the British in Canada. And the most famous of those would be Henry Clay, who went on to be well known for other things, but he was a young congressman at the time and was one of the so-called war hawks. So having gone through kind of that national background, let's get back to Chautauqua County and the story of these supposed first shots. And for all of its problems, I think this story offers us some valuable lessons, both about the War of 1812 and the process of how our history gets remembered and passed on. So I'm going to focus on both of those things going forward. And on both counts, I think it's a good reminder of the value of local history in particular, not just in its own right, but also because it helps us to understand the bigger picture. So this is especially true for the War of 1812, in that as some of you may know, much of the war was actually fought along the New York-Canadian border. So much, in fact, I would say that it would really be impossible to tell the story of that war nationally without focusing some on Western New York. And you see some of the major engagements here. There's a lot happening along the Great Lakes. You can see, and here I can use my pointer for this here for sure. You see a lot of action up here around the Niagara frontier. And I'm having a hard time seeing this map, even with my glasses. But there's a lot of action up here along the Canadian border because, again, there was an interest in trying to acquire land in Canada. So we attempted to invade Canada multiple times, and each of them failed. For that reason, when you travel up in Canada today, most Canadians will tell you that the United States lost the War of 1812. And it's up for debate who actually won it, because the surrender terms at the end really didn't change much. But in any case, you can see lots of action happening in our neck of the woods. And I'll add that the Niagara frontier was the only region of fighting to see military action in all 3 years of the war, from 1812 to 1814. And whoever controlled Lake Erie, as you get a sense from just that textbook map, would have a decided advantage. So our local skirmish here in Chautauqua County is not unimportant in that sense at all. It actually is, now it takes on greater importance. So this is exciting, right? But I think we should remember this story and look into it more and talk about it today for other reasons. For one, it also highlights the important role of the War of 1812 in building Americans' sense of themselves as a nation. And big picture, our country was still very young at this point in its existence. We were still kind of establishing ourselves on the world stage. And some of you may have, if you do remember things about the War of 1812, you probably remember it being called our second war for independence, because it basically forced the British to recognize us as an independent nation. Well, I think it also helped everyday Americans start to forge an identity for themselves, separate from English traditions. And above all, in that identity, it reinforced this idea of us being a liberty-loving people, and also a people who could defy great odds when we set our minds to it. And some of the other things you may remember about the war, if you remember anything, I'm guessing a lot of you may not remember the causes, but you may remember that the War of 1812 is when Francis Scott Key wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. How many of you remember that piece of it? Yeah. And that was when he watched the bombs bursting over Fort McHenry in the Baltimore Harbor, which we have this illustration from. And some of you may know that the British went on to march into Washington, D.C. and burn the Executive Mansion. But interestingly, what we tend to Oh, and this is actually Francis Scott Key's handwritten, the first handwritten lyrics from the Star Spangled Banner, what became our national anthem. It was a poem at the time. But Executive Mansion was built, but what we tend to focus on and kind of the way we tell the story nationally is that Dolly Madison saved George Washington's portrait. How many of you know that story? So again, we kind of put a spin on it. And that's why the White House is white, by the way, because they whitewashed it afterwards to hide the burn marks, if you haven't heard that story. So what I'm getting at is that I don't think it's accidental that the War of 1812 gave us all of these points of patriotism that are now kind of called up as part of our national origin story. We repeat these stories because they do something for us as Americans. They make us feel proud. They reinforce that idea of us being that liberty-loving people that can defy great odds, and even the largest army in the world at the time. And we can fit this into our story of the Canada Creek skirmish too. So our local story is really representative of this national process of what I sometimes call historical fudging when I'm teaching, whereby certain episodes of history and of this war in particular kind of become a part of our creation myth as a country. And we can see how this plays out locally in a second story of the Canada Creek skirmish that I'll share now that originated with early settlers in Fredonia. Anyone here from Fredonia proper? Got some Dunkard people, yay. So, and this is a story that I shared at the Opera House a few years ago, so Fredonians may remember this. It's a story that Fredonia's founder, Zatu Cushing, reportedly passed on to his family, and it was then shared in a speech before the Fredonia Scientific and Historical Association in 1864. In this account, the skirmish is dated to the 4th of July of 1812, when Judge Cushing, in the picture here, was hosting a celebration at his farm, and the judge was supposedly in the middle of giving a rousing holiday oration when, according to the account, quote, the roar of artillery and musketry announced that a battle had commenced at the mouth of the creek. And the account goes on, something was now to be done besides praising their fathers. The men on hand were now required to imitate them. Every man seized such weapons as he could find and hastened to repel the invader. The man telling this particular version of the story, O.W. Johnson, was quick to add that the orator, Zatu Cushing, was at the scene of danger as soon as any of the audience. So all the men rush off, and Zatu Cushing is leading. He's at the front of the pack, headed to the lake to defend against the invaders. There's no talk of the widow Cole in this version of the story, nor does it mention any trading vessel being in harm's way, or the 3 redcoats being shot. All of that's now gone. But it's no less heroic of a story here. Now the hero is Zatu Cushing, and it serves as a reminder of the sacrifice of soldiers during the Revolution. So this story, in other words, kind of becomes a point of pride and patriotism for members of the Fredonia community especially, not entirely unlike the shelling of Fort McHenry becoming a point of patriotism in our national anthem years later and still today. So let's fast forward to our county's bicentennial year, 50 years ago in 1976. When we see the same sort of patriotism in the community effort that resulted in that commemorative boulder being placed near the site of the so-called first skirmish on Route 5. So this marker was a special project of the Dunkirk Historical Society for the bicentennial, and it seems that this is also when the community started to connect the story of the skirmish to the start of the war. The Historical Society wrote to the Observer in this letter to the editor, you see, quote, historians acclaim this to be the first bloodshed in the War of 1812. However, little note of this has been made nationally, and to this day, very little recognition is being made of it. And the words on the plaque aim to change that. And here's a close-up of it. As you see here, the plaque states in no uncertain terms that the first exchange of hostilities in the War of 1812 occurred at the mouth of Canada Creek. seemingly combining the story of the 4th of July oration now with the story of the boat that's chased and the shots breaking out and the redcoats being wounded. So now it's all mashed together. And by this time in 1976, I think we can see that many of these different accounts have been conflated and combined without regard to what actually may have happened. So trying to trace the origins of all these pieces can be exceedingly frustrating. There's a group of us, including Norman, who were trying to do this in 2012 for the bicentennial of the war, and it was challenging. But when we do try to sort them out, the story of the skirmish also has a lot to teach us about how history can get muddled over time and the process of how that happens. And sometimes when I talk about this with my students refer to it as the telephone game, where the message you start with gets distorted as it passes from person to person. You're all familiar with the telephone game? Yeah, so I think it's a good analogy, but why does the message get distorted exactly? That's, worth asking. Sometimes it's intentional, but more often it's not. Often I think it's the result of people making assumptions as they try to make a sensible story out of random facts. And maybe they don't remember the exact facts because it was many years ago and they didn't write it down, but they feel the need to fill in the gaps. I do this myself when I'm telling stories a few years later, and I've caught myself making up maybe some details. I admit it. And then we tend to also want to give meaning to stories when we tell them. So we kind of rearrange the facts to convey the meaning that we choose in the moment. And if we look at the story that Zatu Cushing's family passed down, clearly there's a desire to portray the judge in a positive light here. And interestingly, I would add that an earlier anonymous account of the so-called 4th of July celebration that was interrupted by the British attack actually has a different version of that in and of itself and says Judge Cushing didn't rush off with the rest of the men to defend the coastline. In the other version, he actually finished giving his speech to all the women and children present. Much different ending to that. So interesting thinking about how the teller of the story may have changed that story to suit their needs and kind of the meaning they wanted to give to it. In that other version, by the way, it said that the report of the British attack that time ended up being a false alarm. There's another element that we've got added to this. Okay, but it's also true that some of the distortions can't be blamed on later errors by people years later. Sometimes the original sources are less than accurate too. So case in point, in the early 1800s, I found this funny myself when we were researching this. It was confusing and frustrating at first, but then it gave me a chuckle. The Buffalo Gazette, which was the only newspaper in existence that early on that would have chronicled any of this, they didn't seem to know the difference between Canadaway Creek and Cattaraugus Creek. In fact, one notice from that paper in 1813, which I don't have a picture of, actually implies the two creeks were one and the same, and refers to Cattaraugus Creek with or Canadaway in parentheses. Like the names were used interchangeably. So big error, definitely adding to the complicated picture here. So what if we want to find the real story? What do we do? Where do we look? What is the real story? So I'm going to walk through, as I finish up here, the sources that we do have and kind of let the cat out of the bag if you haven't heard what the real story is. So first of all, there are a couple of rules that I think we can bank on to help us kind of sort through all the muddle. First, 9 times out of 10, the most reliable sources are those closest in time to the actual event. 9 times out of 10, because there's less time for people to distort things. And 2, we want to try to find more than one source from that time period that corroborates the same info. If we can find that, now we're kind of in business, right? So if we follow this pretty simple plan of attack, there are a small number of surviving sources from the period. And when we study them, it becomes apparent why there's so many different versions of the supposedly same event. And it's an easy answer. There wasn't just one incident at Canadaway Creek. There were at least 2 that are documented and possibly more, but 2 that are well documented. So the first document exchange of fire was on September 26th of 1812. September 26th, not July 4th. So incidentally, that was well after other hostilities had broken out in the western Great Lakes and also at Sackett's Harbor on Lake Ontario. So that means it definitely wasn't the first shots of the war. But it's clear that something significant happened at the mouth of the creek on that Saturday, and it was described in 2 letters that have survived from the period. Both of these letters also tell us that the skirmish came after multiple landings of the British to the north to raid other sites along the shoreline for supplies. And we've got all this documented. So the first letter is from the Reverend John Spencer. And he was a missionary who traveled all across Western New York soon after its settlement in the early 1800s to organize churches and then to tend to his parishioners' needs. And he actually made his home in Sheridan, which is where I'm from originally, and shout out to go see the Sheridan Historical Society display because we're on the back wall. It's really great. But he lived in Sheridan, but he traveled all over, and he sent back quarterly reports to clergymen in the Connecticut Congregational Society who were financing his work here. And in his report dated October 1st of 1812, which you're seeing on the screen, he writes that the British were greeted with a fire of 100 muskets the preceding Saturday when they attempted to come ashore about 4 or 5 miles from his house in Sheridan. Now, if you're thinking, well, wait, we don't know which creek it is and which direction was he talking about? This is where a second source comes in. And this is a transcription of what I just told you with the part highlighted, the key part about the British coming or attempting to land between 4 and 5 miles and being saluted with a fire about 100 muskets. Here's our second letter, which we just have a transcription of. We don't have the original. It was published in the Centennial History of Chautauqua County in 1902. A letter by an early physician named Jacob Burgess, who lived in what is today Silver Creek. And he wrote on September 27th, and the part that I've got highlighted kind of in gold on the screen here, near the bottom. He wrote, "Yesterday, the British undertook to land at Canada Way, he identifies it, about 12 miles beyond us." He's in Silver Creek. "Our men at that place fired upon them, so they sailed down the lake past us towards Buffalo, waiting, I suppose, to plunder where they did the other plundering." So that confirms also the exchange of fire and the location and the day, the same day. So now we've got things lining up here. And we also have corroborating evidence for the plundering that the British seem to have been doing in the area at that time from the Buffalo Gazette from September 29th. This is a short notice that appeared there that refers to the biggest incident was the British came ashore beyond Irving and looted what was Lay's Tavern was the name of it then, and that would have been a popular tavern along the lakeshore in that area. So bottom line, we can't connect any of these events to the original story we began with the boat being chased and all that, but we've got reliable documentation for a skirmish of some sort that did occur on September 26th of 1812 at the mouth of Canada Way Creek. And before I move on to talk about the second apparent incident that we have documented, I also want to point out one other thing that we learn in these letters that I just shared that I think is a really important just overall takeaway. Western New York was a potentially scary place to be during the War of 1812 because we were so close to the fighting to our north. And in our case, Chautauqua County, we had about 40 miles of shoreline that was subject at any point to raids by the British. And it would remain this way until the American naval commander, Oliver Hazard Perry, defeated the British fleet on Lake Erie at Put-in Bay off the coast of Ohio in September of 1813. Elsewhere in their letters, both Mr. Burgess and the Reverend Spencer talked about neighbors of theirs who were moving away because of the imminent danger. And they too considered moving their families to safer locations in other letters of theirs. And probably because of the anxiety people had in our area, there were multiple accounts as well that came out years later that after the Battle of Put-in-Bay, people in Chautauqua County could hear the roar of the cannon fire down the lake. The accounts came out after they heard the roar of the cannon fire during the battle at Put-in-Bay. And I feel like that requires a scientist to verify whether that's possible. It's beyond a historian's abilities, I think, but I've always found that interesting, and I wonder if that could be true. But to move on, the second documented exchange of fire at Canada Way Creek took place in late June of 1813, just a few months before that battle at Put-in-Bay that I mentioned. And I'll show you Oliver Hazard Perry here. He's the American naval commander that defeated the British at that key battle in the fall of 1813. He wrote in June of that year, 1813, to one of his superiors that 2 British ships, the Queen Charlotte and the Lady Prevost, he even names the ships, were anchored off Canada Way Creek the day prior, and that he had learned some interesting details about the ship's firepower and the size of their crews from 3 men who had deserted from the Queen Charlotte. Now, some of you may know these factoids fit in perfectly with yet another story of the Canada Way Creek skirmish that I have yet to share that I think people from Fredonia might also be familiar with. Maybe not. But this is a story that also involves Zatu Cushing of Fredonia. And in Cushing's account of it, not surprisingly, he emerges at the center of action. And as I read to you from it, let me put up a modern artist rendering of what the British Queen Charlotte might have looked like. This was the largest of the British ships on Lake Erie during the war. To get a sense for what folks might have been seeing if they were seeing this ship approaching from them. If they were on the shore seeing this coming towards them. So as this story went, Judge Cushing, quote, had some salt stored near the mouth of the creek in an old log house, and went after it with an ox team accompanied by one of his neighbors. They had loaded the salt when a British officer with 13 men landed upon the shore. His companion left to notify the inhabitants. The enemy approached the judge and informed him that he had landed to restore some goods that had been improperly taken. The judge did not believe this, and knowing that help would soon come, managed in every way to entertain them and pass away time. 12 of the British soldiers, having so good an opportunity, meanwhile, deserted. A Frenchman, that I assume is a Canadian, was all that remains, standing there with the British officer talking with Judge Cushing. And some of our men arriving and not appreciating the situation, but seeing the ship laid anchor there and these at least a couple of redcoats standing there, they fired upon the redcoats and broke the Frenchman's leg. So this is another exchange of fire that comes out in some of the later renditions here. So I thought maybe I would leave this one out, but then I thought, no, I want to include it because there's a good twist here. So the details of this story change a lot, and the number of deserters especially seems to vary across the stories. But for the most part, the story is pretty consistent. The British land, supposedly to return some goods they'd plundered further up the lake. Some of their crew members run off and desert, and there's an exchange of musket fire. That's the basic sketch of it. Beyond Perry's letter, there's also a short notice in the Buffalo Gazette that corroborates the basics, kind of the basic plot line there of that incident. So it's likely that this did happen. So now we've got 2 different skirmishes that are documented quite well in the historical record. And we can date this as well from another record that I'll show you in a couple minutes. But before I do that, I want to kind of like dial back and look at the big picture. So if we think about what these stories fail to tell us, one thing I haven't addressed is why the heck would the British be interested in landing at that point on the lake? when they were plundering Lay's Tavern, that was a really big tavern. It was a kind of a wayfaring station where lots of travelers passed. And if they're looking for supplies, it would have made sense for them to stop there. There were, people coming and going, wagons to potentially steal things from. There's one account where they actually stopped a guy with a wagon and actually threatened him with a sword and took some stuff from him. So that kind of makes sense. But why are they stopping at this spot just outside Dunkirk? Not really a settlement there. From best we can tell, there was maybe a small barn that some settlers like Zatu Cushing stored things in for passing boats to pick up if they were trying to get goods out on one of the merchant boats. Doesn't seem like something that would have been on the radar screen, just thinking logically about it. So why were they stopping there? So this is my favorite part in all of this because of the twist, the unexpected twist that comes out through the work, mainly of Doug Shepard, the late Doug Shepard, who researched this a lot and found a lot of great sources when he was looking through, especially the records of William Peacock, who features in this last part of the story. So we get a big clue in the letters that William Peacock wrote during the war. If you are unfamiliar with him, he was the person who was handling land sales in Mayville at that point for the Holland Land Company. This would be during the War of 1812. And in July of 1812, soon after the war began, he wrote to his superior for the Holland Land Company in Batavia that the locals were concerned about some potentially illicit activity happening here on the lakeshore. In his letter, he accused a few, quote, unprincipled characters of smuggling supplies to the British from the mouth of Canadaway Creek. Certain merchants by the names of Hale and Lovejoy had stashed 379 barrels of flour and a number of barrels of pot and pearl ash in a barn there at the creek mouth. And as Peacock understood it, there were, quote, British boats hovering about that place in order, as some of the inhabitants believed, to take the property away in the night. Now the plot thickens, right? So, in fact, according to Peacock, that's one of the reasons why the militia had been assigned to guard the lakeshore there. It seems they were doing their patriotic duty to stop some potential traders from selling goods to the enemy. So this could be local gossip, but William Peacock was pretty well plugged in, and he seemed sincerely worried. So we add this to the things that we know as well. And here I'll give a little additional context. For all the emphasis on patriotism that I was including earlier in time, a lot of that developed after the war in how we remembered things. During the war itself, the United States was a very divisive place. So this was a very divisive time in our nation's history when political infighting had reached a fever pitch and there were a lot of conspiracy theories circulating about who was in cahoots with whom. The two political parties at the time, if you don't remember, were the Federalists and the Republicans, the first that had formed in the U.S. And as far as the Federalists were concerned, the war against Britain was a costly and foolhardy mistake of the Republicans controlling the government at the time. A lot of this political background, incidentally, comes forward in this fairly recent book by Alan Taylor, a pretty acclaimed historian, and I highly recommend this for anyone who wants to read up on the War of 1812. He goes into way more detail. It's a lengthy book, but really good. But the larger context of this political division helps explain why there might have been people in our area who did not support the war and who might have wanted to help the British to bring it to a speedy end. And we have documentation for this as well. In April of 1813, this notice appeared in the Buffalo Gazette. It's a notice of a meeting that was held in Chautauqua County by, quote, Friends of Peace, Liberty, and Commerce. It was held in Pomfret, and those present put forth the name of Jacob Houghton of Pomfret as a candidate for the state assembly in the upcoming elections. And at that point, he would have been representing then the counties of Niagara and Chautauqua. that were in existence at that time. And the notice also gave the names of those present. If any of you wanted to mine that for information, there's a lot of names you might recognize. I haven't mentioned anything for folks in the southern part of the county. 2 names that might jump out at southern county folks. Samuel Sinclair, founder of Sinclairville, right? And James Prendergast, founder of Jamestown. So these are big names. There's also big names from the North County that are in that list. So a lot of prominent men. And while I'm not suggesting that any of them were involved in these efforts to supply the British, I think we can assume that there are people in our county who didn't support the war. And there could have been, it could be true that these merchants in Fredonia were actually acting upon that and trying to slide some supplies to the British in hopes of maybe ending the war more quickly. So I find that plot twist to be really interesting. I also think it's important to note some of the context behind why there might have been deserters that were coming ashore as well. Alan Taylor's book shows how common it was for folks along the US-Canadian border to have divided loyalties at that point in time. Most of the settlers in what is now Ontario, which was then called Upper Canada, were either former Americans who had supported the British during the American Revolution, Tories in other words, or they had been attracted there since the end of the Revolution by the Canadian government's offers of nearly free land. So that means a lot of people actually had relatives on both sides of the lake. So it stands to reason that this war kind of upset the very fragile stability that had been achieved since the Revolutionary War and kind of stirred things up again. And we've got folks who were maybe having second thoughts about being up there and maybe wanted to come back to the US. So this helps to explain why there are multiple accounts of deserters from the British fleet coming ashore at Canada Way, for sure. And perhaps the most obvious thing that I haven't talked about at all, though, and focusing on kind of all this myth-making and the skirmish and what's true and what's not, is just those militiamen and men from our county who would have served in the war. And that's another whole talk in of itself, and I'm not a military historian whatsoever. I'm more, historical memory is more something that I'm interested in. So, but we can find some overall big picture things just in what we've learned about the skirmish. And one of them is a really important thing that I don't think a lot of Americans realize. Most Americans who fought in the War of 1812 served in militia units, just like the men who supposedly repelled the British in Dunkirk. And this was owing to the Revolutionary War generation's concerns about having a quote-unquote standing professional army. In other words, a permanent army. In the years after the Revolution, each of the states provided for citizen militias by requiring that every adult male between the ages of 16 and 45, or it went up to 60 in some states, gave so many days a year to drill with their local militia company. And the Madison administration, this would be President James Madison, actually depended upon these citizen militias to supply the bulk of the fighting force during the War of 1812. So it's plain to see that this may not have been a good strategy because these are men who are not trained professionally, and they came together once a month to make sure their firearms were in good working order and they remembered the commands and stuff. So they kind of get a bad rap in some of the textbooks, especially earlier textbooks. This was a political cartoon kind of making fun of their ill-preparedness and lack of discipline. But the last thing I'll mention before finishing up is that I think they tend to get a bad rap, though, and local history helps us to understand that, because we know from local accounts of men who did engage in some of the action on the Niagara frontier that this was no small deal. And for example, the Battle of Black Rock, which is when Black Rock was ultimately burned, in December of 1813, we had lots of Chautauqua County men who answered the call to go up to help defend what we would call Buffalo. And they went 3 to 4 days without having any food or water. One of them, Jonathan Lee from Sheridan, talks about having no rations given to them. There are other accounts that suggest that at various engagements throughout the war, that militias sometimes didn't even have firearms. If they didn't have their own weapon, and they volunteered to come up. We can't assume that there were weapons to give to them to actually participate. So that's not on them, that's on mismanagement and leadership. But something specific I'll share with you is if you're interested in this part of the war, I recommend reading about the Battle of Queenston Heights. Really interesting engagement. This was our first attempt to invade Canada in October of 1812. And I came across it because one of the companies involved in the action was from Chautauqua County. It was commanded by Jehiel, I'm not sure how he pronounced his first name, Moore, who was the founder of the village of Forestville. And anyone from Forestville, or who knows how he pronounced it? I'm not sure if it was Jehiel Moore or Jehiel Moore. Jehiel? Thank you. So his unit was present. We also had officers. I'll show you, got some pictures. And you see, I have done a longer presentation. I'm going to cut this short now, though, because we've been here sitting a long time. But David Eaton was a lieutenant in that company. He's from Westfield. Also got Charles Burritt from Fredonia, I believe. And this is our Sheridan guy, Jonathan Pattison, who was a corporal. And I mention this because if I go back, I want to go back to this picture. Our men actually scaled that cliff that you see. It's an over 200-foot cliff. And the orders were to scale the cliff and try to seize the battery at the top. And Chautauqua County men, by virtue of it was a narrow trail going up. And by virtue of where they ended up on the trail in order, when people kind of, narrowed down into single file to go up the spots where they could find bushes to pull themselves up, they ended up being at the front of the assault. And they did a great job. They actually were successful in taking control of the top of that precipice when they got to the top. But unfortunately, there weren't reinforcements that backed them up that continued from across the river there. The Niagara River is right there, as you see in the other picture, the modern day picture. This is near the Queenston-Lewiston Bridge. You get a sense for the height that they were scaling as well. So there weren't enough militia and Americans who came across the river to reinforce them for them to hold the position, and they had to surrender. So that invasion of Canada failed, but not for lack of really a lot of courage and skill and just kind of pluck, I would say, to work their way up that cliff, pulling themselves up by roots and bushes and things, whatever they could grab to climb up, of our local guys from Chautauqua County. So I'll end with that and see if any of you have any questions, depending on time we have. Yeah. Absolutely.
And as the president, I do research on our veterans, and I look back on our pension records. So I'm looking at vital records from that time. They're either a widow's pension or the soldier's pension when they're applying for their money. And in many of these pension records, I'm finding that they say we served under Captain Tubbs at the Canada Way Creek. Mm-hmm. And that is not just 1812, but it's throughout the whole war from the beginning to the end. And Celia Sampson living right there on the Canada Way Creek, we can see how she would aid and assist the soldiers. Three of her sons were soldiers in the War of 1812.
I did not know that.
Yes. One of them is buried in Forest Hill Cemetery. We're going to honor him on September 5th, along with his parents, Celia and Seth Cole. Seth was hired to cut the road when Dunkirk, Fredonia was just wilderness. And the only way to get there was on the water and on the beach. Mm-hmm. The Holland Land Company hired Seth and a number of other men to cut the road, and I have the original documents where they paid him and talked to him, as well as Celia when she was a widow, living on the Canada Way Creek and assisting the soldiers that were stationed right in her front yard.
Yeah.
So she is given a patriotic award from 1812 for her patriotic service, as well as Seth for cutting the road, and their son, I can't pronounce his name. He had three. The easy ones are buried other
They
places.
had great names back then, didn't they?
Esterus or something like that is at there. So if you are from this area and come to Forest Hill Cemetery on 10:30 on September 5th, you could share in our ceremony. I have purchased a headstone for Celia because she has no headstone there.
Yeah.
And Celia and Seth's names, as well as their marker, will be on that headstone. So I don't know about one battle. I'm sure there are multiple times where Celia assisted the militia that were camped. And I found that from pension records, and which were pretty old documents.
Mm-hmm.
So
Thank you for
thank
sharing
you.
that.
I just had to share that because this is what I do. This is my passion. And I kind of know these soldiers from their pension records.
Yeah, and I assume that
Yeah.
that company of militiamen would have been
Captain
kind of
Tubbs
stationed or
at Canada
keep-
Way Creek.
Yes,
Yeah.
but I assume it would have been through the Battle of Put-in Bay at least. I don't know beyond that because there wouldn't have been
I think they were
as
just
much
stationed.
danger.
I
but-
started reading the pension record, and of course it brought my attention. It was a long one. It was page after page after. And he says, I was stationed at Canada Way Creek.
Mhm.
And then I've brought up other pension records from other soldiers from Chautauqua County who say the same thing.
Mhm.
No one date covers the whole war.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't take any more
Really
time,
good
but I
point,
just want
yeah.
to share that with
Yeah,
you.
really good point.
Thank you.
And we did have 40 miles of shoreline. So you think about that. That's a lot of shoreline that we had to protect. Any other quick questions? I'm around the whole day, so. Okay. Thank you all.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for attending the expo, and thank you for coming to this lecture. Now, this coming lecture is one I have seen previously myself, so I know that it's top quality. You're really going to get a lot out of this one. This is Lieutenant Colonel Paul Fardink, who I know primarily as a fellow member of the local chapter, Chautauqua County chapter, Sons of the American Revolution. And he has seen an opportunity and taken a lead in a project that's both interesting and highly worthy. And here we are, Paul,
Thank you.
your crowd.
Thank you. Thank you, Norman. Adjust this. And when I need a slide, I'm going to say next rather than try to use the clicker, because being a senior citizen, I'll mess it up, Okay. As Norman said, I'm Paul Fardink, and I'm a vice president of the Chautauqua County chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution, which is part of the state. It's a state umbrella organization, the Empire State Society, which the national society, all 50 states have a state association, and they're umbrella associations for the counties. So that's how it's all organized. Okay, next. This presentation's in two parts, okay? The first part, I'm going to talk about the Patriot soldiers. Get away from it a little bit. Okay, thank you very much. The first part is on the Patriot soldiers, some of the demographics of those that are interred here. And then the second part is on the Markers program, which I'm responsible for the Chautauqua County chapter. Next. So as I've already said, we're going to talk about the Patriot soldiers first, some of the demographic information next. But before I do that, I just want to share with you a thought. America was founded on a bold proposition that justice, freedom, and democracy can serve society far better than mandates from faraway thrones. Proving that theory took bold people who were willing to die for it, not just for their own time, but for Americans not yet born. We call them patriots. Next. And again, this was mentioned previously. Much of what I'm going to present comes out of these two books here, okay? You can purchase these from the Daughters of the American Revolution. They have a table in the auditorium. It's only $20 for the two hardback versions here. And a lot of it, information was compiled, from these two books. And I find it quite amazing because the first book was done in 1981. There was no internet back then. That gentleman did a lot of work, probably through the U.S. mail, researching so much of this. And there is a lot of information in these books because it's a basic biographical sketch of each patriot. It talks about where they were from, the unit they served in, and when they moved back into Chautauqua County, where they lived and where they were interred. Next. There are 337 patriots outlined in that first volume. Later on, working with the DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution, Cates published volume 2. And that included another 23 patriots. So 370 total. 366 are definitely interred within the county. There are 4 outside of the county, Cattaraugus County, Pennsylvania, and also Ohio. Okay, but 366 in the county, buried in our cemeteries. 356 were born in the 13 original colonies. And you can see 245, 79% of those were in New England military units, while 117 from Connecticut and 112 from Massachusetts. That's where a lot of them came from, Connecticut and Massachusetts. 16 of these were taken prisoner, which I will tell you who they were. 13 were wounded in action. 1 woman out of the 370, there was a woman, Susanna Ferry. She served in the 1st New York Line as a field nurse. I thought that was pretty amazing to have a lady among all these gentlemen. How many of those 370 patriots were born in this area, were from this area? Anyone know? Who said none? Congratulations. 0. And why was that? Next. This is why. If you look at the map here, this is at the end of the French and Indian War, which was talked about earlier. At the end, King George III said, hey, look, we've signed the Treaty of Paris. Colonists, you stay on the eastern side of the Appalachian Mountains. Here's the line that was drawn. You stay on the eastern side because on the western side, that's the Indian Reserve. So to put it very kindly, here we are over here in Chautauqua County. We're in Indian territory. Basically, the Senecas, the gatekeeper of the West versus the Mohawks, who were the gatekeepers of the East. Okay, where was the population? Again, I mentioned Connecticut and Massachusetts, so many of them there. The dark blue area is the concentration along the coast. That's where most of the population was in the colonies, in those shaded areas. The total population back then, only 2.5 million people, just 2.5 million. It was interesting because when King George III took charge in 1760 after the death of his father, he was only 22 years old. Boy, and I said, what a young age to assume all that responsibility. Next. 5 veterans, some of these were mentioned earlier, fought in that French and Indian War. You can see their names right there. If I happen to mention a name of a patriot ancestor of yours, raise your hand, stop me, okay? Because that's always nice to hear, from an ancestor. Okay? Here's George Washington, a young George Washington. And I just mention this because if you study George Washington and his career, boy, you talk about a baptism in fire. That's where it really happened, especially 1754, when the British unit that he was in charge of, with the Senecas, ambushed this French unit just outside of Pittsburgh is where it is. And he was accused of a massacre. No, that was a peace envoy. You had no right to attack and massacre those, especially the Senecas, what they did. Pretty gruesome stuff. But he really got his baptism in fire, and I'll not going to, boy, there's all kinds of stories about that, especially the following year when they buried General Braddock in the road after he was killed. Next. How they served. It was already mentioned previously that the militias were so predominant during the Revolutionary War. Of these 370, 202 were in the state troops, levies, and militias, typically for a period of 3 months to 6 months. 148 were in the regiments of the Continental Army, and 20 of those unknown. There was just no history that could be found on those out of the 370 total. Next. How they served. I just heard in the previous lecture, Major Samuel Sinclair. No, there were nobody above captains in this Revolutionary War bunch here. There's 370. You can see most of them were privates. Okay? The highest achieved, there were 4 captains. Sinclair didn't become a major till later on. This was after the Revolutionary War when he continued to serve, militias. Okay, 7 were ordained clergy, which I'm going to show you. 8 were drummers or drum majors. 9 were fifers. Next, where they served. Already mentioned previously, 21 of the 370 were at Lexington and Concord. 18 were at Bunker Hill. 8 crossed the Delaware with George Washington at Battle of Trenton. 35 were in the Saratoga campaign. Somebody tell me why Saratoga was so significant. Anybody? Right. It's because after that, the French came involved and they started to support us. And I'll tell you, you look at the Battle of Yorktown with the French fleet there and all those French soldiers, we probably couldn't have done it on our own. I'm pretty sure of that. That's the Battle of Yorktown right there, the surrender. Next. Go back if you would. Yeah, 22 were at the Valley Forge encampment, and I'll mention some of those by name in a second here. Norman mentioned Major General John Sullivan's expedition to the Iroquois. The Iroquois were never the same after that. They really destroyed, not just, it wasn't so much taking prisoners or captives or killing people. It was destroying their homeland, their crops and their gardens and everything. 6 would witness the execution of John Andre, the British spy, so involved in West Point. And 19 were at the surrender of Cornwallis, as I just mentioned, at Yorktown. Okay, next. 23 of our veterans were sons of fathers who also fought. We had 11 pairs of brothers in the county. We had 5 that previously fought in the French and Indian War. 9 would next fight in the War of 1812. And I'm going to show you their names. A sizable group greeted Lafayette in Westfield when he did his tour, when he came back to the States in 1825, and 30 greeted Lafayette in Fredonia. I don't know how many of you were in Fredonia last summer when they had the reenactor. Lafayette came to Fredonia, the reenactor, and that was a tremendous ceremony. I might mention this too about the Iroquois, because, the Iroquois supported the British except for the Oneidas, okay? The Oneidas were scouts for Lafayette at 2 of the battles during the Revolution. In fact, the Oneida contingency, the scouts actually visited Washington at Valley Forge. And I thought that was pretty significant. But just like the rest of the Iroquois, after the war, they didn't fare too well. Next. Here are the 13 soldiers wounded in action. And I'll just pause a second so you can look at their names. And again, the towns where they're interred now, the townships, here are the different battles or the skirmishes, and here's the injuries. And some of these were pretty severely wounded. In fact, William Adams became an invalid, basically, as did William Dickinson down here in Turden, Ripley. But anyone see anybody up there they recognize or they're a patriot of? No? Next. 16 soldiers were taken prisoner. And I show you this because I like to mention about 3/4 of the patriots aboard British prison ships died. That was approximately 11,000. If you were taken prisoner, typically you ended up in New York City because the British controlled New York City during the war. And they took a lot of their old gunboats and they converted them into prison ships. And there you see the most infamous one right there, His Majesty's ship Jersey in the harbor. And you can well imagine, especially in the winter, there's no heat on those things. Your rations were, maybe you got something once a day. When you read about the literature of these, yeah? You're descended from who? John Pickard. There he is right there. John Pickard. Thank you. They were on the prison ships or they were in several prisons along the shoreline. And 11,000 people perished. And if they were lucky enough, fellow prisoners were still able to take a party ashore and bury you along the shoreline. Otherwise, they were just dumped overboard, most of them. But very few people realize the magnitude, of the prisons, what they went through. But you can see, boy, to survive those prison ships, it was like 25% could survive that. Okay, next. And I mentioned town of Stockton, which I'm going to mention the signers of the Declaration and the townships that are named after them. And Stockton's one of them. It's Richard Stockton. Obviously, he's not interred in Chautauqua County, but I just wanted to mention something. Next, if you would. Richard Stockton, he was basically from the Princeton area, okay? And when his house was overrun by the British in November of 1976, he was captured and imprisoned on one of those prisons along the shore. He wasn't on a ship, but he was in one of the prisons. Basically, he almost starved to death. His health severely deteriorated. His estate, I found this of significance. This is what a lot of the signers went through. He isn't unique. His estate in Morvern in Princeton was occupied by Cornwallis, who surrendered at Yorktown. All his furniture, household belongings, crops, and livestock were taken or destroyed by the British. He had one of the best libraries in the colonies at the time, and it was burned. So he paid the price with his estate. He never was free, of the sickness, and he became an invalid, and he died very early on, 1781, before the war was over at age 50. So just an example of what some of them went through. Next. Here's our drum majors, or drummers and drum majors. And you can see there's Orange Spencer. He was also a fifer. There's another fifer down there, Cyrus Fish. Okay? My favorite, if I'm allowed to have a favorite, is Barnabas Wellman. He's buried in Bustye off Wellman Road. How about that? He ended up being a drum major because of his length of service, almost 5 years of service. And he was with Washington most of that time. He was at Valley Forge with Washington. And drummers were significant because that's how you called the troops to order, the different orders of battle. The different messages across the battlefield were done by drummers. And to become a drum major was significant. Look at the ages of the drummers. So many of them are so young. Why is that? Well, a lot of them had fathers that were serving. And the fathers, rather than leave their sons at home, maybe there wasn't a mother anymore, they took their sons along with them. Maybe a lot of them became drummers or fifers. Okay? I'm going to talk about Barnabas Wellman shortly. Okay? Next. Oh, go back. I'm sorry. This photo right here came out of the Connecticut archives, because you can see Barnabas Wellman was a Connecticut Continental line, and they actually had his name on this. And I don't know if that's an actual painting or not, but I thought that was pretty unique. If anything survived of one of our soldiers, I would like to think that's Barnabas, but I can't prove it. Connecticut Archive says it is. Next. Okay, here are the Pfeiffers. Again, very young age. Okay. I'll mention Orange Spencer again. And there's a Revolutionary War Fife. 9 of those, again, average age 14 years, 3 months. Very young to be a Pfeiffer. Okay. Anybody see any names there? Next. 7 ordained clergymen. That's kind of a famous portrait you see a lot with George Washington on his knees during the harsh winter of Valley Forge. But anyhow, there's Orange Spencer again, interred in Ripley. 7 ordained clergymen. Okay, next. Here's some demographics I found kind of interesting. If you look at the left side on ages, yeah, you had 2 12 years old, 4 13-year-olds, etc., etc. 13 enlisted at the age of 16 or below. Again, a lot of them fifers and drummers, okay, but 33 at 16 or below, now interred in Chautauqua County. Over here, I find quite amazing, considering the period of time when they came back to Chautauqua County. It's the early 1800s that some of them would live this long. I mean, 43 would pass away at the age of 90 or above. Okay, and you can see 14, age 90. Some of them lived to be pretty good, pretty ripe old age. I don't know about the 107-year-old. I mean, that's what the literature says, but I kind of doubt that. Until yesterday, I was at a veterans luncheon, and there was a World War II veteran there. He's 105 years old. And he's just sharp as a tack, too. And I said, how you doing? And he said, well, I just celebrated my 105th birthday. I went skydiving. Wow. Good for you. Okay. Next. Here's some other demographics I found mind-boggling. Okay. This is the number of children in the families. Yeah, here's one family that had 19 children. And you can see, if you look at the left side here, if you total all those up, okay, 61 men had 10 or more children. 61 men had 10 or more children. That's 727 children in this county. If you look at the right side, you've got 92 men that have 5 to 9 children. That's another 654. So you have 153 men on this slide that had 1,381 children. I get tired looking at that one. But why? But why? Here's a big reason why over here. 260 had one wife, but 47 had 2 wives, and 5 had 3 wives. Why? Because back then, if you lost your wife or your husband, there was no Social Security. There was no social services. There was nothing to rely on. I need to get married. I got to work the field. So lots of times there were marriages of convenience, to survive, just survive. So, that's the reason 47 of them had 2 wives. And it'll tell you that in the literature. Okay, next. Popular first names of soldiers. Oh, you see it today. John, William, Samuel, they're all pretty common today. I'll just let you look at that a minute. But the popular first names. But I also found some rather unique names down at the bottom. A lot of the names came out of the Bible, obviously, okay? And some of them were fruit. Lemon, orange, yeah, Varnish. How'd you like to be called Varnish? I wouldn't. Okay, next. What about the wives? Again, popular first names of wives. And you see a lot of those today. Boy, I see a lot of Hannahs today. Okay? A lot of Hannahs, but those are popular first names of wives. But again, same way with the men. You look down here, some of the wives' names. Again, it comes right out of the book here. Azuba, Delight. Oh boy. This is not X-rated. I'm not going to submit. Lord. Okay, Prudence. Zema. Here's my wife's, Lucretia. She loves that one. Fanny. Get your Fanny over here, Fanny. Sorry. Next. Where are they buried? Okay, again, these are the townships. You know, some of the townships, you know, like Ellery's got 4 different cemeteries, but if you total up what's in the town, burials in the town of Ellery, you'll see 18. And that's the way most of these are. You can see where most of these are interred. I'll let you look at that for a second. VFW Post 8647, who this morning presented the colors, and I'll talk about them a little bit later here. But you can see, next, Jamestown. Okay, 10 of them are in Jamestown. A lot, you know, along the North County, especially Villanova, up in Westfield. A lot of those cemeteries hold a lot. Oh yeah, Pomfret especially. There's a cemetery in Pomfret that has 17 in it, in Portland. Okay, there are 53 that just doesn't exist because regretfully, a lot of these men, they came back. They're living with family when they passed away. If there wasn't a cemetery close, lots of them were buried on the farm. And their graves were not really marked all that well, and a lot of them were never moved into a real cemetery. That's the problem with the unknowns. Next. 9 veterans of the War of 1812. There's Alexander Finley. Finley Lake was mentioned earlier. Okay. The War of 1812, which was just described. And that was a great presentation. Thank you. Okay. Did she come back in the room? I'm going to ask the question now. I didn't ask it during the briefing. And that is, you know, how many were here for the last presentation? Raise your hand. Okay. Do you see all those marvelous ships? Yeah. The British ships all came across the ocean, right? And came into the Great Lakes? No. Where were they built? Oop, she's got a microphone.
Yeah, Paul, you probably would know better than me. Honestly, I'm not a War of 1812 expert at all.
I'm not either, really.
It's multiple places. I mean, they're in Canada for the British, but then we had ships that were built at Presque Isle and also, I believe it's Sackett's Harbor, right?
Yep. Yeah, a lot of them. But I just found that amazing. She showed photo of just some magnificent ships, and to think they were all constructed, you know, right around the Great Lakes there, you know, what the skill that took, you know. Yeah,
I want to say Port Abino up in Canada, Abino or Abino for the British, which is not, I mean, it's kind of directly north of, or a little bit to the west and north and west of Dunkirk.
Yeah. Boy, that's convenient. You still have a mic.
I didn't know we had a mic. Can you pass it around?
Okay, next. Okay, this is part 2. This is the Patriot markers. And you can see several examples of the Patriot markers there, which I'm going to describe. Next. The Pomeroy Foundation in Syracuse, New York, they're the sponsors of all of this. And they're the ones that fund the marker program for the Revolutionary War Patriots. But they have a lot of other programs. I lost count of how many programs they have, really. Legends and lores, you know, cultural tourism that promotes about different legends, like Sleepy Hollow's one that comes to mind. New York State Historic Marker Program. You see a lot of these around the county. National Register Signage Grant Program. Next. Revolutionary America, here's one they have. I haven't seen any of these around the county. The Lafayette Trail, you know, that was big, especially last year. And then here are the Patriot burials that we do in Chautauqua County. And there are a lot more programs. They have a website. You can go online and check out what they do if you are so inclined. Next. Just a description of the markers. Here's the one in Asheville, Maple Grove Cemetery. But they're blue and yellow with raised lettering, yellow border. The top of each marker has the state SAR label. You can see New York State. They are 32 by 18 inches. They're cast aluminum. They're heavy. They weigh close to 50 pounds. 7-foot pole, aluminum poles provided. The markers are two-sided, so they are mounted vertical to the road so you can see them coming from either direction. If there are 4 or less patriots in the cemetery, typically their names are added to the marker, as this, you can see Asheville's is. If there are more than that, typically it's just the name. Like here's Lakeview in Jamestown. At least 10 veterans of the Revolutionary War are interred here. Okay. The application process, because I know as soon as I'm done, a couple of you will come up and go, how do I get a marker in my cemetery? Well, it's an application process that I have to do. And you need photos of the original markers if it's at all possible, because the foundation is tough on that requirement. They want to see the original grave markers if at all possible, which can be difficult at times. It must include proofs of service. Again, you got to go back to source documents. Ancestry.com is a great source of that, where you can go back and find actual regimental rolls where they're listed in a particular regiment, or a pension data. That always works well too. But for instance, these wonderful books, I can submit these all day long, but they don't accept them because it's secondary data. So just something to know about. Okay, and once approved, it has to go to the foundry out in Ohio, and it takes 4 to 5 months to actually get the marker. Next. Here are where the Patriot markers are currently located. There are 20 of them. Okay, Maple Grove Cemetery in Asheville that I mentioned was the first one. Tillotson, Wellman, again on Wellman Road, Panama. These two right here, Stillwater and Kyntone. There's a DAR member that helps me with these markers. Loretta Smith. I don't see her in the room though, but I just mentioned, usually when she's, present at one of these presentations, I mentioned her. Hatch Clymer. Next. Lakeview Cemetery in Jamestown. Finley Lake, Gary Hill, Blockville Union Burying Ground. You see the rest of them. I'm going to talk about a couple of the dedication ceremonies, what they're like. Next. DeWittville we just did. I'm going to mention that one because it was pretty special, in my opinion. All of these have been dedicated except for Teft Cemetery, which is right next to Peak and Peak. And that will be dedicated on September 6th, before Labor Day, the 7th. Okay, but 20. Next. This is a typical ceremony. You can see this was the Asheville, the first one we did. Typically there's a welcoming, there's an invocation done, the Pledge of Allegiance, a speaker. Usually you have town officials that will speak, an honor guard who will fire their rifles. There's 1286 Legion Post out of Lakewood. Taps will be played, and then they'll do a roll call of the different veterans that are interred there and, basically where they served. And typically during the unveiling, it's a town official that will do the unveiling, or a cemetery official, because, most of the cemeteries are under the townships now. There are still private cemetery associations, but more and more are converting to the townships. Next. Again, I wanted to show you Lakeview Cemetery. Again, there's the Vietnam veterans assisting with that, their honor guard, which I thought was very nice. Here we are at the dedication ceremony, the unveiling by the cemetery committee there. Always have DAR and SAR members that participate. These are all Daughters of the American Revolution ladies that participate. Okay, I just wanted to ask you a question here. There are 10 interred in Lakeview. You know how many were interred there originally? Zero. Where was the original cemetery in Jamestown where many of them were moved from? Anyone have a clue? Anybody ever been to Prendergast Library? Yeah. That's why I don't go in there at night anymore. No, but that's where a lot of them were interred, right around the cemetery, Prendergast Library. Next, here's Clymer. And I got to tell you, Clymer went all out, set up tents. You know, typically if it's nice, the Cemetery Association or the Historical Association, you know, they'll serve punch and cookies and all those great things, you know, following the ceremonies. Again, here is the VFW post 8647, which was here this morning. Great supporters of the dedication ceremonies. Again, all the DAR and SAR members, you know, that showed up for that. And there's the Cindy Willink. She's the historian for Clymer, unveiling stuff there with her son, who's the supervisor. Next. I want to mention Clymer. Again, another signer of the Declaration. Clymer's named after George Clymer. Next. Again, I just wanted to mention what some of them went through. He was away from home, and in 1777, British troops vandalized his Chester County, PA home near Philadelphia, while his wife and children hid in the nearby woods. And they basically destroyed most of his home. They were lucky that he wasn't taken prisoner, because many of them, if they were taken prisoners, they were considered traitors. And King George III said, hey, traitors are to be hanged, you know. So they really put a lot on the line. Somebody asked about the Whiskey Rebellion. Yeah, he continued service after the Revolutionary War. You know, he was there during the Constitutional Conventions. And he was there during the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. Is that gentleman in the room here today that was asking about the Whiskey Rebellion? Did you come back? No? Okay. There's something very unique about the Whiskey Rebellion. George Washington is president. Now, I just mentioned this because I really like this stuff. But he was president during the time when all these farmers that were selling whiskey, you know, didn't want to pay the whiskey tax, you know, basically revolted with arms. And he actually put on his Revolutionary War military uniform, grabbed Alexander Hamilton, had him put his on, and they were in charge of the troops as they went into western Pennsylvania near Pittsburgh to quash the revolt. Luckily, you know, there was minimum gunfire, if any at all. I don't recall. But I thought that was pretty unique, to be the commander-in-chief and actually command the troops. Yeah. Next. Oh, here's Blockville. Again, just showing you. Many of you probably know Pam Brown. She's a historian for North Harmony and the town of Harmony. I am periodically asked to put on my uniform. That's me, okay? And be the guest speaker. That's her husband, supervisor. But they had quite a ceremony up there. That was during Flag Day, our Armed Forces Day, I'm sorry. And they dedicated several markers up there in Blockville, at the Blockville Union Burying Ground. They had quite a ceremony there. It's nice when you can do that kind of thing. And back there is 8647, again, the VFW post. Next. And again, just more pictures of Blockville. Again, all the DAR, SAR members, 8647. And I show Jeff Crosley. He's our president of the Chautauqua County chapter of the SAR. And there he is in period costume. Okay, next. Finley Lake. Again, what is unique is you try to get children there. Try to get children interested in our history. Here we have Eagle Scouts that were there. They were the flag bearers. They were there for the dedication ceremony. I was the guest speaker that day, so I got to ride in a golf cart, which was nice around the lake there. But again, there's Miss Brummagem, town supervisor, unveiling the marker with the town historian. Typically, same type of agenda. Next. I show this one because it was brutal. Because as Thomas Paine wrote in 1776, these are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in crisis shrink from the service of their country. And the residents of Bemis Point did not shrink from the dedication ceremony. It was brutal that day, the winds and the snow. But it ended up being quite a nice ceremony. The Ellery VFW post is indeed unique. Unlike the uniforms you see from the other supporting organizations, they show up in the uniforms they wore during the various conflicts they were in. And I thought that was pretty good. And there's two of the DAR members freezing. There they are right there. They come and they'll portray, this lady will be Martha Washington for the kids, and this lady will be Betsy Ross. So it's nice. Next. Here's the last one I'm going to talk about, it's DeWittville. And again, I wanted to emphasize the fact, got to have kids there if we can, children. There's the Chautauqua Lake Central School, 4th grade class. And again, it was magnificent. 35 of them showed up. And I salute that teacher because those kids, after the dedication and everything, ask all kinds of great questions about the Revolutionary War. Boy, I'll tell you, it was heartwarming. It was. They were really into it. Great bunch of young people. Next, just some unique stories as I finish up here. Next, the Badge of Merit. This is indeed significant when it comes to the history of military decorations. Back, George Washington say, I got to honor the privates and the corporals, because up to this time, anywhere in the world, if you got a military decoration, it's usually because you were a high-ranking officer, typically a general. The troops never got recognized, but Washington said, hey, my intention is to foster a sense of mediocrity, or metocracy, within the military, stating that the road to glory in a patriot army and a free country is thus open to all. And he created this, okay? The Badge of Military Merit. It was a pivotal change because it emphasized the importance of recognizing the contributions of all soldiers, regardless of rank. It later became the Purple Heart. Obviously, it's purple and it's the shape of a heart. 2 patriots in Chautauqua County received this award. And typically it was for length of service. You see 6 years of faithful service for this gentleman. This one had almost 5 down here. Okay? And Napoleon learned from George Washington because, later on when he was doing all of his conquests in Europe, 1810s, or a little bit earlier than that, he made the statement, I have found men to fight to the death for a few pieces of colored ribbon. So George really started a lot of that, George Washington. Okay, next. Here's one of my favorites, Drum Major Barnabas Wellman. He was there during the erection of fortifications at Dorchester Heights, right at the very beginning. He shared the distress at Valley Forge, where he was compelled, this is surviving literature from the period, especially in his own hand, where he was required to take his own shoes, cowhide leather, and eat it, when he was at the Valley Forge. He was a drum major for 4 years and 8 months, and he was right there as a drum major with George Washington, okay? Spent a lot of time with Washington in the various conflicts. Buried in Wellman Road. He had an ancestor. He just passed away last summer, Major General Wellman, in the reserves, Army Reserves. Next. Okay, here's the one lady. Okay, Susanna Ferry. You can see she was buried right now in Pioneer Cemetery in Forestville. That's one of my next targets, is that cemetery, because we have to recognize this lady. We have to. Because I think that's something very special. Again, just like a lot of the drummers and fifers, they had family fighting in the Continental Army or the militias. The same with her, you can see she was the mother of 8 children and the wife of a soldier. And a lot of the families were camp followers. You don't read about that. But, you know, sometimes there was quite a entourage of camp followers, of families following the army. Next. Again, I got 15 minutes. I'm good. I like this one. John Cowling in Lakeview Cemetery. He was at West Point. Remember when Benedict Arnold became a traitor, and he was working with the British out of New York City to turn over West Point to them. He was giving them the fortifications, and I don't mean to insult anybody, but General Arnold had commanded at West Point at that time, but had escaped from West Point on the same day that the soldiers, Cowling was among them, returned from their chopping wood expedition. And after his desertion, the militia came in from various directions, and the forts were filled, and the shores of the river were set with guards to give the earliest intelligence of any movement on the part of the enemy. That previous to the discovery of the treason of Arnold and his desertion, the soldiers were considerably scattered, and the cannon in some of the forts dismounted at Arnold's orders, because he was preparing it for the British to invade West Point. And Washington arrived at West Point right after the treason was discovered, and Arnold had made his way down the river into New York City. Kind of a special place, because Washington really considered West Point and the Hudson River key to the Revolution, because if it got divided, it would really separate the colonies at a critical point, at a critical time. There's the chain that they put across the river at West Point, and parts of that chain still survive. If you ever visit West Point, it's up on the shore, and they rebuilt a lot of the redoubts there too, that you can see a lot of the fortifications. Next, a couple of unique soldiers interred here. Here's Hendrik Ball. He was both British and American armies, okay? Originally from Germany. He was a Hessian soldier taken prisoner by the colonists. He was exchanged, but then deserted the British. He participated in the Yorktown campaign, so he actually fought against his previous army. He died in 1810, age 54, in Pomfret. Here's another unique soldier, a British soldier from Sheffield, England. He was there when Burgoyne surrendered, again at Saratoga. He escaped prior to shipment, because a lot of them were pardoned that they would go back to, Europe. He was esteemed by his neighbors in the town of Pomfret during a span of 8 years, where he remained as justice of the peace and a town clerk. And that's where he would die, and that's where he's interred now. So among those 370, we had a Hessian and we had a British soldier, which I thought was kind of unique. Next. Again, just some of the names in Chautauqua County. Again, there's Alexander Finley, Finley Lake. And again, you were here for the previous discussion. And again, the population in Chautauqua County was just starting to take hold. Here's Alexander Finley. He built his power dam for power up there in the creek, 1815, okay? One of the first settlers. There's William Bemis Point, where his son put that first ferry across the lake. Again, it's 1805, 1806. There's Samuel Sinclair, Sinclairville. Again, 1810, when he cut a path, a wagon road from Canadaway to where Sinclairville now is. Okay, so some of the namesakes and the dates, and you could read all that, but where they came from. And very instrumental in the early Chautauqua County history. Next. Again, just a couple other names. Levi Stedman. He's buried in Pleasantville Cemetery in the town of Chautauqua. His grandson is considered the founder of Stedman, New York. And in Stedman, he built a couple of large buildings, and they created dulcimers. In fact, the Stedman dulcimer became very famous. He was making 500 instruments a year, employing 6 young men from Germany and Switzerland. It was quite an industry. And Norman Carlson, again, wrote quite a paper about the dulcimer business here. But so much of it was right there in Stedman. And then there's Samuel Kennedy, who was Here's a marker, Kennedy Mills, because they built a mill there in southeastern Chautauqua County, and the location of Kennedy now. And that's his son that actually built that. He was never really lived in Chautauqua County, but it was his son that did. Look, next. I just want to mention this real quick. The names of the townships of Chautauqua County after the Declaration of Independence. Next. There you see them. In the red, the signers of the Declaration and the towns that have taken their names. Gary, Clymer, Ellery, Stockton, Carroll. Basically, 5 of them there. People say, oh, Roger Sherman. No. When we dedicated the marker in Sherman, I was corrected right away. Roger Sherman, that's his son. His son was named, Sherman was named after his son. It wasn't the father. Okay, next. But that's a common mistake, you see. And the last thought I want to leave you with is what James Monroe, as our 5th U.S. president, stated. He himself was a Continental Army veteran. He was wounded during the Revolutionary War. And when he became president, during his first State of the Union address, he made this statement: drawn with peculiar interest to the surviving officers and soldiers of the Revolutionary Army. In a nutshell, it is believed that among the survivors there are some not provided for by existing laws who are reduced to indigence and even to real distress. And that was true. Next. Because again, back then, what was the emphasis on? The emphasis was on self-reliance. It was not on entitlement. There were no entitlement programs, there were no VAs or Social Security. There was none of that stuff. And some of their homes were destroyed. You can see a lot of it in these books here. Land had gone unattended. Maybe mom couldn't handle it, or the neighbors didn't help, or their family wasn't big enough, or their lack of pay or use of worthless continental currency occurred numerous times. Promissory notes that proved worthless or sold for pennies on the dollar to speculators and investors. Promised land grants that never occurred or happened. And they were denied a lifetime pension at the end of the war. It wasn't until 1818. Okay, if you were 20 in 1776, now you're 62 years old. You had to be a Continental Line soldier, Continental Army, not a militia, and you had to serve 9 months, and you could apply for a pension. In 1820, this is what was heartbreaking in my book, Continental Line soldiers, okay, they added a need-based requirements. He's now 64 years old. He had to appear before a magistrate. You can see evidence of this in Chautauqua County. A lot of it's in these books where, as a patriot soldier, you had to appear before a judge, a magistrate, and declare yourself to be in dire straits, that you needed a pension. And I would find that incredibly humiliating myself to have to do something like that. But that was the requirement. And finally, in 1832, now he's 76 years old, also, if he's still alive, all surviving veterans. Now the militias included. Naval forces with 6 months service could apply. And then finally, in 1836, surviving widows who were married before the war's end could apply. But boy, they went through a lot. And when you say, well, our Revolutionary War patriots sacrificed, you're darn right they did. Okay? You're darn right they did. Okay. Next. Questions or comments? Yes? Yes, at the end, because they weren't, I'm sorry. I'll tell you what, why don't you ask the question in the microphone there?
Right, so my question is, were the Revolutionary War soldiers ever paid with land, like homesteads?
Yeah,
and were they in the county already, or did they move from outside the county?
Some of them moved from outside the county. You can see it in these books. Yeah, because they weren't paid, a lot of them. And rather than getting any kind of cash, you were offered some land.
And were
But
they typically-
usually it was in the wilds, though. It wasn't anything that was, it was heavily wooded typically. There hadn't been any improvements of any kind.
I mean, a lot of the homesteads here, weren't they 100 acres?
Oh, they were huge, some of those land
Yeah.
grants. Yeah, but I can't tell you exactly. But I remember reading about it in the books here. Some of them were pretty good size, what they would get. Unless somebody knows, speak up. Yeah.
Western Reserve in Ohio.
I'm sorry.
The Western Reserve in Ohio.
Yeah.
All the Western Reserve.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a lot in the Western Reserve.
And thank
A
you
lot
for
of
your
these-
talk.
A lot of these patriots, though, they came here, and when their families had already moved here, a lot of them moved in with sons that had purchased land here from the Holland Land Company, again, which really didn't take place till the very late, 1798, 99, when the Holland Land, and early 1800s, Yep, right? Yes, sir. He's going to give you the mic. Yeah.
If you don't mind, I'm new to this area, and when we're driving down 394, we see Fardink Road. Could you explain how, if you do relate to that, the history of the Fardinks?
Oh boy, I didn't want to bring that up. Yeah. No, I'm just kidding. No, that's my family, Way back, they didn't serve in the Revolution, that particular part of my family, but they came here out of Holland. They were part of the Holland Dutch, that moved in Clymer there, but some of them came to Lake Chautauqua. They built a big mill there, big sawmill, and they had farms there. And Fardink Road was nothing but farmland back then. But when I was born in Jamestown, I was raised on Fardink Road. But when I came back after 24 years in the Army, I did not live on Fardink Road. I lived in Lakewood. Yeah. But yeah, it was all part of the farm back then. It was just an old farm road, really. Yeah. Anything else, anyone?
Yes, right here. In reference to your question about land grants, east of Cambridge Springs, Pennsylvania, is a large tract of land that was given to a revolutionary soldier. It eventually became a state pheasant farm, and now it is a state game lands.
Wow.
And also the Holland Land Company was predominant in Meadville, Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
They had a lot of transactions in that area.
Yeah. Yeah, he wasn't a Revolutionary War soldier, but Paul Busti, town of Busti, was an agent for the Holland Land Company way back when. And I guess they thought enough of him, they named Busti after him. Yeah, speaking of Holland Land Company, for what it's worth. In fact, you still find medallions. I'll go to household sales once in a while, and you'll find these medallions of Paul Busti. Yeah. That's unique. Next, anything? Okay. Well, thank you. Yeah, thanks. Oh, again, I put in a plug for the Daughters of the American Revolution. This fine book set in a gift ribbon, $20, if you want to learn about the Patriots, Yep.
Here, our closing lecture for the day is Rhonda Hoffman. She's one of the most experienced and well-known genealogists in this end of the state. She works in the legendary Grosvenor History Room at the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. And she writes for many sources, including the Western New York Genealogical Society that's exhibiting there in the other room. And here she is, right from Buffalo.
Thank you guys for coming today. I'm originally from Chautauqua County, Dunkirk, so I'm really excited whenever I get to speak in Chautauqua County. So I was thrilled when Norman mentioned this to me. So if none of you, I have to give a little plug for my library while I'm here. So I work at the Grosvenor Room at the Central Library in downtown Buffalo, and we have numerous Western New York resources, as well as resources from where a lot of our ancestors, our revolutionary ancestors came from, the New England area. We have many local and family histories, as well as transcribed records. So please do check out the library's website. So for those of you who, well, let me ask, how many of you are trying to get into like a lineage society or just starting their search for revolutionary ancestors? Okay. Who's found a bunch of revolutionary ancestors? Okay. Well, if any of you are just getting started, the way to start is by simply doing your genealogy research. You need to start building family trees. And we don't have the time to go into that today, but I wanted to refer you to the Grosvenor Room's blog where I've recorded a bunch of classes on how to get started with genealogy. So please see our blog for those free classes. We also have a number of guides on our website, including one for researching New York State Revolutionary War soldiers. So the way I would start, if you're starting out and you're trying to see, do I have any soldiers? To help identify soldiers, you want to think about the time frame of the war, 1776 to 1783, the typical age of those who served, 22 years old, and the age range of who served, 16 to 60 years old. So the typical years of births could range from 1715 to 1767 or thereabouts. And what I would do just to get started is wherever you've built your family tree, whether that's online in Ancestry.com like I have, or another website, or if you still have things in paper format or your own software, start looking through your family tree and get to the right generation. So here I have me started to the right, and you just keep expanding out your tree. My mom's side, my dad's side is Polish, but my mom's side were early U.S. settlers. And one of her lines that has some Revolutionary War soldiers is her Livermore line. So if any of you guys have Livermores, please let me know. So I would look here, and these middle parts of the tree here, the second row and this third row, look like they're people who could have served in the war. So I would start looking at their profiles, and someone that I'm interested in is this Abijah Livermore. And I would click on their profile and see what I have for them. And I would start marking these people as possibilities. And what you can do is over to the right, if you click Tools and you click View Tags, you can start tagging ancestors that you want to flag as possible Revolutionary War soldiers. And then once you get to the tags, you can make your own custom tags. And I might put something like Revolutionary War, and then I put P for possible. You only get so many characters in here. So you kind of have to, you might not be able to spell out all the words that you want to spell out. So that's what I would start with. And then I would look at the profile and I would see, have you found that person's 1840 census if they were still living at that time? The 1840 census may list the name and age of pensioners for revolutionary or military service. So this could be someone who fought in the Revolutionary War, or it could be another war. So oftentimes you might see War of 1812 soldiers this way too. And these censuses aren't quite as detailed as some of the more recent censuses that we have. We just have the head of household named. So I'm going to zoom in here. And I've boxed off my Revolutionary War ancestor, Samuel Munson. And there's his line, and there's multiple pages to this record. So if I turn to the next page, there's a column here that it has the census enumerator write down the names of who are collecting military pensioners and their age. So I'm going to zoom in one more time. And there are two people. The bottom there is Samuel Munson. You can see some of these records aren't in the best condition. So I made the little box different colors because sometimes if you change the color, you can read things better. And, you know, for this era, there can be a lot of documents that you need to do that with. So my Samuel Munson is there at the bottom, and he was 78 years old at this time. And then there was a Mary Eaton and a David Eaton. And I looked into them, and it turns out that Mary's husband was in the War of 1812. And so that's why these individuals are listed. Another thing that you can look at that's kind of, a quick thing, low-hanging fruit that you can check off your box is looking at Find a Grave. Find a Grave is a free website. You can search it in Ancestry.com, but you can also go to the website itself and put in that soldier's name and see if they are in here. Many volunteers go into cemeteries all over the U.S. and transcribe gravestones, and they might add other data like biographies, and you can see that right about where it says Find a Grave down here. There's some text having to do with Samuel Munson, and what you might notice is on his gravestone, it says Samuel Munson, Pennsylvania, Private Continental Line, Revolutionary War. So there might be a notation on a gravestone, or you might see that societies like the Daughters of the American Revolution may have put a flag on their grave or some other marking on their grave to indicate that they were a Revolutionary War soldier. Another thing that you can do is use the Daughters of the American Revolution genealogical research system. It is free to use this. You don't have to be a member. How many of you are DAR members? Anybody? No? Okay. I am. We have an Abigail Fillmore chapter in Erie County, so I'm a member of that society. So this is their genealogical research system. And if you click on it, you can do a search. You can see that there are asterisks, red asterisks by some of the fields. So you have to add something into at least one of those marked fields to search. So I wanted to put that person's name that I saw in my tree. That was a possibility. So I went ahead and put in his full name, Abijah Livermore, and I searched, and if he is in here, then it'll usually show birth and death information. It tells that his service was in Massachusetts and his rank was lieutenant. It gives his place of birth, Weston, Massachusetts, and his death, Spencer, Worcester County, Massachusetts. And it gives some of his service descriptions. So these are some of the captains or other military members that he served under. And you also see that it does list two spouses there, Anna Graves and Sarah Howe. Now, if you were to click on, there's a red box in the corner up there. If you click on that, you can see who might have filed the line that was approved into the Daughters of the American Revolution. And you'll see, you might see some of your ancestors' names to help figure out, oh, is this my Abijah Livermore? Because there can be, same named individuals. And right off the bat, I saw Ezra and Millie Gage, and I knew that those were my ancestors. So this told me this is my guy who I think is my ancestor. And one thing that you should get excited about is if the top listing here has a little orange box that has an S on it, and that means that there's further documentation. And you can see these purchase buttons. If you see that, someone submitted some kind of documentary evidence for their family tree. In earlier years, the Daughters of the American Revolution maybe weren't as strict about the sources that they allowed to prove military service, but nowadays they're very strict, and you really need to do good genealogy research and support all of your conclusions. So If you want to save some time on your research, you could order a copy of the record and hopefully you'll get something good in there. I did it for one of mine and I was very pleased. I found some hard to find obituaries that the microfilm was just in poor quality, even though the newspapers were online. When I was keyword searching, I didn't find those articles. So I had to, once I knew the date of the newspaper, I went to that date and found it online. You can also do a search for descendants. So when someone applies to like Daughters of the American Revolution or Sons of the American Revolution, you have to prove from you back to that revolutionary soldier. And so you can search these for individuals that are in your family tree. If you want another way to be sure, this is my Abijah Livermore. So one of my ancestors from the Livermore line was Callista Livermore. So I put that in and you can see that I've got her there. And then I've got her husband there. It gives her husband's name. And scrolling down the page, I get the whole line. So from from the applicant all the way down to the soldier. I should also mention that to join these organizations, you may not have to prove that someone had military service. You just had to serve the United States in some way, support the United States in some way. And that could be as simple as you paid a certain tax that supported the U.S. So after I did this, I went through my tree and looked at all of the lines. And after I did this kind of, we can call it sort of quick and dirty trees, I call it, because, I haven't looked up all the documentation for this yet, but I wanted to note people in my tree that I want to investigate further. I came up with 21 different people who might be Revolutionary War soldiers in my family tree. And when you make those tags, like I mentioned in the beginning, you just have to click on, you can view a whole list of all of your ancestors in your tree, and then you can just click on that Revolutionary War tag that you made, and you can see your whole list, and then you can start investigating these, and you've got your list always handy with you in Ancestry if that's what you use. I do want to mention that the Sons of the American Revolution also has a free online index, so that's something that you should look into too. So I'm going to get in some different record types. And one of my favorite genealogical records overall are pension files. Pensions were given according to U.S. laws, and the laws changed over time. And there could be dramatic changes in short periods of time. And the laws usually became more lenient as there were less surviving soldiers because then they had to pay, less pensions, or when the country was doing well financially. These laws often changed for political gain. So someone who's running for a particular office might say, I'm going to give more benefits to soldiers, and then maybe more people could get a pension, or maybe they just got more money for their pension. Just to give you an idea of how laws might have changed. I'm not going to read all of these, but you can see there were multiple changes from 1806 to 1878. And they did get more lenient. So before 1806, Revolutionary War pensions were only for the Continental Army, not state militia. But by 1832, the law changed that every officer or enlisted man who had served at least 2 years in the Continental Line or state troops, volunteers, or militia was eligible for a pension of full pay for life. And there's more to that there. Then by 1836, not only soldiers could get a pension, but widows could get a pension. Widows of any veteran who had performed service as specified by that act I just read you was eligible to receive a pension that might have been allowed the veteran under the terms of the act. If the widow had married the veteran before the expiration of his last period of service. And then over time, that got more lenient. By 1853, all restrictions pertaining to the date of marriage were removed by these acts. By 1878, widows of Revolutionary War soldiers who had served for as few as 14 days or were in any engagement were declared eligible for life pensions. So when these new laws were made, you'll see there'll be a push. You'll see a whole bunch more people applying at these timeframes when things got more lenient. These files can be so detailed. And when you're searching for pension files, the basis is that this soldier served in a war, and then sometimes family members could get a pension as well. All of these pensions will be in the same file. So when you search for the soldier, the widow's pension would be mixed with the soldier's pension application. So these can give a lot of detailed family history and reveal family connections. This is my soldier. He was from Portland here in Chautauqua County, Samuel Munson. And this is the widow's pension. And it says, in the state of New York, County of Saratoga, Hannah Hamblin of the town of Moreau in said county saith that she was 77 years of age on the 4th day of March last, that Martha Munson of Portland in the county of Chautauqua is the sister of the deponent, and that Martha is about 4 years and 6 months older than this deponent. And that Martha was married to Samuel Munson at her father's house in the town of Bristol in the county of Hartford and the state of Connecticut by the Reverend William Robinson of this town of Southington in Connecticut, sometime in the year 1783. So you can see all of this important information, and there might not be vital records for this time frame. So we can not only learn about those who apply, but we might learn information about those who gave affidavits. To get a pension, a soldier had to prove their military service. They may have had to prove disability. And for a widow to get a pension, she would have to prove her relationship to the soldier in addition to the soldier's service, if that wasn't already proved. So oftentimes there aren't early records, especially in New York State. We didn't start keeping marriage records until the 1880s. So we might have to find church records, or we might have to find witnesses who were at the marriage who can testify like Martha's sister did. I often see this with, I shouldn't say often, but I would say military pensions in general, especially the early years, you might see Bible records included as proof of relationships. So this is the Munson family, and there is this copy, or not a copy, they would have to tear out the page from the Bible and turn it in because we didn't have copy machines back then. So it lists all the family's important dates here, and I get not only Samuel and Martha's information and their marriage information, but all the children are here. So think about these files as telling information about other family members too. This is some other data that I learned about a different ancestor. And this is one of my people. His name is Abel Root. These pension files are very good for determining a place of birth as well as other places lived, because usually they would have to tell where they lived over time. And So this gives that Abel was born in Walpole, not Massachusetts, New Hampshire in 1765. By 1872, he was living with his father's family in Windsor, Vermont. He enlisted in the military in Bethel, Vermont. He lived in New York State between 1819 and 1828. And then between 1828 and 1832, he lived in Erie County, Pennsylvania. And it gives some other information here, including that he had a brother named Rufus Root, who testified to a lot of what Abel said about his military service. And so I didn't know this brother's name before, and that was in here. And I could then link the brother to his father, so I found the likely father of Abel. I'm about to go live on some websites, but I wanted to show you a couple of books first. A good book, and I do have it with me today if anyone wants to have a look at it afterwards, is called New York and the American Revolution, a source guide for genealogists and historians. And the Daughters of the American Revolution published this book, and it gives lots and lots of source possibilities for people who were in New York State that might have served in the Revolution. There's also a great book for Chautauqua County, and I do believe Norman has it here in his office. It's called Patriot Soldiers, the Veterans of the War of the American Revolution of Chautauqua County, New York. And it includes cemeteries where soldiers were buried, and there's genealogical and service data in these biographical sketches. And it's a good size book. It's at least an inch thick, if not thicker. So you might find your ancestor in that book. I also like to give a plug for the Western New York Genealogical Society, which I'm a board member for, and there's my email. I can show it at the end too, but if you have any questions, feel free to follow up with me afterwards. But I recently, for the February issue of their quarterly publication, I wrote an article called Selected Sources for Researching Western New York Revolutionary War Soldiers. And I think Norman has these in his office too, because we give them to county historians. But I go into different databases and books and free websites, many different resources that can help you. So let me go to some live examples. And I am going to first show you how you can find a Revolutionary War pension if your ancestor applied for one. And you only had to apply for one for these records to still be out there. Even if you were denied, there will be a pension file. And this is terrible to say, but it's kind of good if they had a hard time getting a pension, because then they had to try to prove more information. You might see more affidavits and more other documents in the file. So these Revolutionary War pension files are available for free in the National Archives and Record Administration catalog. Anyone can access this catalog. And it is on that guide that I mentioned. So all you have to do is just go to the main catalog and put in the soldier's name. You can just put in the name if you want, but I would put pension in there too and do a search. So I just searched for Abel Root pension, and you can see I got a number of hits. It will pick up those keywords, whether they're together, like the name you want it to be, or whether both of those terms are somewhere in this online record. And the top one looks correct for me, so I can click on that. And here is Abel Root. This is just the beginning card of his file, but down on the right, you can see there's 17 pages to this file. And I've seen pension files that have had over 100 pages in them. So you really want to get a copy of these records if they're out there. And you can view it right here on the website and go page by page. But then down on the left here, you can click download. Now, sometimes it will download a whole file, which it did for me here for this record. But if they're super big, you might have to download each image individually. I also wanted to show you, I don't know how you guys feel about AI, but how I got that summary of his service is, these records can be, difficult to go through sometime. Maybe you're really anxious, right? You got the pension file, you want to know what's in there. This is ChatGPT. It can transcribe records, and there could be errors, so you always want to double check what is transcribed or what information is correlated and compiled. But I just gave it a simple prompt. Please transcribe these Revolutionary War pension file documents, then summarize the military service, residence, genealogical, and biographical data in it. And then there you just click a little plus symbol and upload the documents you want it to look at. And it took a few minutes, but you can see it transcribe things. Here's all the transcriptions, and it did a good job. And you can see it even keeps the layout of the document. And then it starts summarizing the evidence. It tells me there's a discrepancy in the identity of one of his captains. So that's something you want to look into to see if errors were made and what is the truth. Gives me a nice chart for the residence history. So, I can maybe start looking in these locations for records to see if I can confirm those. And then it tells me there's also a chronological conflict enables residence statement. So, you have to look into those things and clarify them. And then it gives me the genealogical summary, more info on the age discrepancy, and biographical information. So you've got a starting point, and then you want to make sure you look at the record yourself and see if it's right, because AI can be wrong and it can hallucinate and make up an entire record if it wants to. Another great source of Revolutionary War data is the U.S. compiled Revolutionary Military Service records. And this record set is pretty easy to search. This is an Ancestry. And you can just put the soldier's name in there. If it's a super common name, you know where the person served in the military, you could put the state in here. Or you could, if you're not quite sure where they served, you could put just a location. A lot of people served in one state and then collected a pension in another state, or moved, during any kind of military career. And so you can click search. And I got a number of hits, and I can see here, who I think is right. And I'm just going to click on one. It gives a rank, his military date. He was in the Connecticut 3rd Regiment, and you can click on the records and see that data. So the compiled military service records, they'll often list the rank, as well as it might list the date that they were present for service. It might list payments. So this is the date of enlistment, and it says the term was for the war in general. And then this is another individual, and it lists all of these different card numbers that are associated with this soldier. So the more those numbers you see, the better. Here you can see this was the company muster roll, his term of enlistment, and then more information for the payroll. So what date range was he paid for, that kind of data. So that's another great record set. I wanted to show you in general how you can investigate what is in Ancestry in terms of military records. And what I like to do is, anywhere from the database, you can typically go to this menu, this search menu, and you can click on military. You can search from this screen if you want to, but I typically like to drill things down further. So what I might do is I might view all in the card catalog over to the right. And then you can narrow things down by the filters that you see here. So we've got different types of military records. So if you're looking for a pension, you could click that. You can click by different locations. So if you wanted US, you could do that. What I often do is I'll go into the title fields and I'll put in whatever the war was, so revolution, and I'll put an asterisk after it, so it'll pick up any databases that have the beginning part of this word. So it could be the word revolution, or it could be revolutionary, or any other ending that is after the N, after where you put the asterisk. And you can click search. And you can see all of these records. I got 152 different databases for Revolutionary War. What I usually like to do is you can sort your results by record count, because I'm always curious what record sets have the most information. Where am I most likely to find my ancestor? And I might pick that. And a great set that's in here, I mentioned the Sons of the American Revolution. There are some application files in here for the Sons of the American Revolution. Of course, you can put in a full name. I'm just going to put in a last name. And you will get some information so you understand who that name is you clicked on. So the name was John Ames Russ, said he was born in Utica. His role is he was an ancestor to the person who served. And then it gives some family information, his father, his parents, his spouse, and children. To see more information, you want to click on the image. And here's the application. So right on the front of the application, we'll see a person's name. This is Daniel James Francis, and he is a descendant of the soldier Nathaniel Wilson Rust. And it tells when the application was approved in 1896. So these files are quite old. And you can see it gives a full lineage, usually with birth, death, and marriage dates of, it'll start with him and go down to the Revolutionary War soldier, or even one generation earlier than the soldier. It will give military service details. It gives signatures of the applicants, a lot of times off to the right. This is where you're going to see, it might reference like a history. This one is referencing records of Connecticut men in the War of the Revolution. It gives a page number, and it gives a bunch of other citations to other sources. And usually these are around 4 pages long, I would say, and you can see there's more information listed on the back. I just want to go back to my results list. There is another record set, U.S. Revolutionary War rolls. So these are muster rolls. Muster rolls are the lists of people who joined the military. And typically you just see the basic enlistment data on here. So you can see the names, the term of their engagement, and then it gives some wages information. It gives a discharge information. This person at the top, Barker Pompelson, I believe that says, and enlisted in May, 20 days to June 6th. There's another database here, U.S. Revolutionary War pensioners. Whenever you're looking at these data sets, Ancestry is really good. A lot of the major databases are really good about understanding, helping you understand what is in these records. So here's the source information, and it lists these original records which state their ledger payments from the Office of the Third Auditor of the Treasury. They're on microfilm. It even gives this number that's blue that you can click on. That's a National Archives identification number. So you could click on that. You might see more information. So I've just popped into their online catalog, and you could see whether it was online through them yet, and it says not available online. And then it'll include a nice summary of what you might find in here. So this is, you're typically going to learn if the pensioner was a veteran, and the location of the pension agency where the payment was made. An heir or legal representative claimed an unpaid balance due to the pensioner at the time of death, and other reasons why someone might be listed in here. Another database where you might find the Revolutionary War pensions is in Fold 3, which is a subscription database through Ancestry.com. So if you subscribe to that, the U.S. Revolutionary War pensions are in there. And another great resource is this blog. It's called The 12 Key, and it is by a former archivist at the National Archives who's very knowledgeable about military sources, and she has many articles that she has published in different genealogy magazines in here. So you can see all of these different, like here's the National Genealogical Society magazine, and she's done different topics, but you can look through her topic list, and you can even read the whole article right here online. So if you wanted to learn more about those compiled military service records, you can learn more. You can keyword search her blog right here. I could search for Revolutionary War and see if what kind of hits I get. And you can see there might be blog posts that she wrote about the war. So she is just a wealth of knowledge, and where you can follow up following this presentation. So I wondered if any of you have any questions for me, and it can be about this topic, or maybe you want to ask me about something related to my library, or I do know a lot about Chautauqua County research. Yes.
information on him. No picture.
That's true. Was he married? He wasn't married? No. Hopefully there's a compiled military service record that might list his enlistment, or he might be on a muster roll. Hopefully his compiled records will list his death. There might be histories too. If you look for history books on that, you might find a section that might list, how many soldiers died from a particular disease. And I always say, when you look at those histories, look at the source citations to see where they found that information, and then follow up with those sources. Try to get those original sources to see if there's more data about your ancestors. And I'm just going to put my email back on here in case any of you have any questions. So if you do have questions later on, don't feel bad about emailing me, or you can contact the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library and say, send this to the genealogy lady, and it'll get to me. You don't even have to remember my name. Yes.
Thank you. It's kind of related to the time period, but not necessarily military. Is there a way to track marriage certificates that are related to Native Americans?
For this time frame, I'm not aware of any. But I would check with the particular tribe to see what kind of records they might have. I know if it was locally Seneca, on their website, they have information about genealogy requests. Sometimes, if it's not in this area, I've seen Family Search in particular have records, like for some Western tribes, that I was surprised that were out there. So that's something I'd check. Definitely check. You could check. You can double check to make sure that the person wasn't in the war. There could be a file out there. They may or may not have received a pension. But if there was one, then there could be marriage information in a pension file. Any other questions? Okay. Oh, yes.
Just a point of information. John and Susan Sipos are out in the room out front. And Susan and John are both very interested in the Native American culture in this area, and they go to the genealogical meetings that the Seneca Nation has in Chautauqua County. So you might want to check in with them at their booth and see, or just Google it, I would think, and find it. And they're open to the public also, and they could be maybe very helpful. I've been to a couple of them myself, so.
There's, that group is called the Iroquois Genealogy Society. And I'm not sure about this time frame, but they have been compiling a lot of records and histories and putting them on their website. So there's, under collections, there's document archive, there's presentations that have been done for them, there's stories and narrations. So I usually go into the document archive, and then you can see the different records that they have, and you can click on them individually, and they're usually scanned and put on there in their entirety. Not always, though. Yes.
How would you find out if one of your ancestors had been a
I would start, let me pull up my presentation. That's okay. That's okay. So what I usually do to start is to look at the tree that I've built. You want to look at soldiers that are of the right age. So like born between, say, 1715 to 1767. And I would then, just go through my tree and identify those folks. So here, like these middle two rings of people were like about the right ages. And what I do, if you have Ancestry or maybe whatever format you keep your tree, is I start keeping a list of possibilities. So this is my ancestor, Abijah Livermore, and I made a tag for him that says possible Revolutionary War person. And then one thing that is easy to check is the 1840 census, if he was still living at that time. The 1840 census had a column for if you were a military pensioner and your age. So this could have been the Revolutionary War, but it could have also been other wars, like the War of 1812. So if you see them there, that's certainly, they had some sort of military service. Looking at find a grave sometimes is easy if you haven't gone and visited their grave. You might see on their gravestone that it says they were a soldier, and it might give their service information, or there might be a marker by a local lineage society, a Revolutionary War lineage society. You can go into the DAR genealogical research system, the Daughters of the American Revolution, and you can search for an ancestor's name to see if anyone gained membership through that person. And it will give you a way to, you can see, these are a number of different applications. And then you can also see a descendant list or search for, say, you have someone in your tree and you're just wondering if anyone with, in their line might have been a soldier. So one of my ancestors is Callista Livermore. And it turned out she was in here. And then it gives the person who applied, it gives their lineage from them all the way down to the soldier. So you can see, is that really my line, or is it somebody with the same name? It usually gives birth and death dates. And I'll go through, and I tagged, like when I went through my tree and looked at that system, I found 21 potential Revolutionary War soldiers in there. And then you want to follow it up with, original documents to make sure that the research was correct. So in the early days of the Daughters of the American Revolution, they weren't as stringent about approving their lineage, so they may not have used original documents. So you'd have to, really prove the descendancy. Another good thing is to look in pension files, which are online for free in the National Archives and Record Administration catalog. And if you want, I mentioned that I wrote an article for the Western New York Genealogical Society. If you want to take my email, I can even send you guys all the different resources that I listed on that article. And let me give you my email again. So here is my email, and I'd be happy to send you all those sources. Other than the pension file, you might see muster rolls. You might see some financial documents, compiled military service records. And there's a book that I have on the guide, and I actually have it with me here. I can show you. I'm about out of time, so I have to wrap it up. But there's a book of sources for New York State genealogy and the sources for Revolutionary War. And there are some guides for other states as well, in case your people weren't in New York State. So I know we've got some people going on next. So thank you so much for coming and seeing my presentation today. And please reach out to me with your questions. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you everyone for coming. We're going to start this off real quick. We would like to honor the Chautauqua County History Expo Committee for all the work they've done with an America 250 commemoration. So we want to thank them for all the work they've done to promote America 250.
Norman Carlson.
We'll give it to
on behalf of the committee.
On behalf of the committee, we're going to award this to Norm Carlson.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm honored and delighted to receive this, but please do remember that I had a terrific committee that helped me put this on. And this has been kind of a high water mark in my career, and I've certainly appreciated all the cooperation that I've had from you folks.
Well, we appreciate all the hard work you and your committee have put into celebrating America's 250th anniversary.
All right. And there's things I always say when I get before the public, and that is volunteer for your local historical society, keep a diary, and remember, everything written about the past tells more about the time that it's written in than the time it's written about.
All right. Thank you,
Thank
Norman.
you. It is my honor and pleasure to present Mr. Gregory Berner, the outstanding teacher of American history from the Jamestown chapter NSDAR. Mr. Berner was recommended to our chapter by a local resident. Once we began to research Mr. Berner, we were overwhelmed with what an outstanding job he was doing both in the classroom and out in the community as well. I would like to quote a letter written by one of his former students. I have learned law from professors who have earned their Juris Doctorate from Harvard and Yale and have taken a world history class with one of the world's leading Thomas Jefferson scholars. Yet when asked who was the teacher that had the greatest impact on my life, I never hesitate to say my 11th grade history teacher, Gregory Berner. When my classmates and I reminisce on our high school years, the conversation always turns to the impact Mr. Berner had on our lives. He was the first person to hand us the keys to a world beyond our small town. He gave us something more precious than a good grade. He was the first adult to speak to us as if our opinions matter, and the first to show us the power and value of knowledge. I love his philosophy toward American history, and I will quote him, "Unless you understand where our country comes from, how it was formed, and its amazing history, it is very difficult to understand where we are now and the directions we want our country to move in the future." His award of the Teaching American History grant and his creation of the We the People program is an inspiration. Through his leadership of the We the People team, the Westfield School District has won many awards against some very stiff competition. He was also a recipient of a fellowship through the Robert H. Jackson Center, which enabled him to create lesson plans about Justice Jackson and his career. Mr. Berner, a 28-year veteran teacher in the Westfield School District, has dedicated his career to impressing the importance of American history in our everyday lives. I have never had the opportunity to present this award to an individual with a more impressive background than Mr. Berner. Please join me in congratulating Mr. Gregory Berner, the Outstanding American History Teacher Award winner.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Get on the other side of you. How's that? Whatever, if you want.
I just want to say first and foremost, thank you to the DAR, the local chapter, DAR, for honoring me with this award. And then the DAR Society as a whole for keeping history alive. It's organizations like this one that make my job a little bit easier to keep history relevant. And you use the words from one of my past students, and that's also an award in and of itself. It makes you think of the impact that we can have by what I call doing history. I'd also like to thank, I don't know the names of the people that I should be thanking as far as putting this little local history organization together, the Chautauqua County Historical Society, and all the components that went into putting this together. I just spent the last hour going out, checking the individual displays that were put together, and that was really cool. And again, all these people that keep that history alive. As far as this award goes, it is more, I think, a testament to how much I love teaching history. And words from my past students certainly make me feel good about it. And if I can pass anything on, I usually use a quote from Benjamin Franklin, who was asked, once they created the Constitution in 1776, right? We just celebrated the 250th birthday. I'm really excited about celebrating the 250th birthday about the Constitution. To me, that Constitution, the Declaration of Independence that sets it up, that talks about a government that is going to be pushing towards equality, that's going to be pushing and accepting of the people, that's going to hear their voices. That Constitution that we still have as the law of the land is the oldest living Constitution in the world today. We're not the oldest country by far. You can think of our home country, England, where the colonies came from. But as far as living constitutions go, the U.S. Constitution is currently the oldest. Many were rewritten around World War II. But the 250th anniversary of that should be also celebrated just as much, because it's that document that, going back to my Ben Franklin point, is this republic that we established. And Ben Franklin was asked by a lady, what kind of government have you created? Because we certainly didn't want the monarchy of England, and the Articles of Confederation, a state-led government, was not working out very well. And he said the words, "It's a republic if you can keep it." And certainly that's where we, the people, come in. And I think we have an obligation to not just great man history that I sometimes teach in the classroom, your George Washingtons, your Abraham Lincolns, but all the little components of history that are out here. And I appreciate my family. I want to thank them too for all the lots of trips that we've taken. I just brought my family back from Cleveland, and my granddaughter, who you can hear out there talking away, she has a little history site, National Historic Monument passport, and her dad, my son-in-law, Matt, he thanked everybody in the family but me. And he specifically said, "Because I know you want to be here anyway." And so on our way to Cleveland, which was our jumping point, we go and see the historic site dedicated to President Garfield. And he's right. I would love to be to any type of history thing like that. So I really love and appreciate the support that I get from my family, who puts up with my history, diving into history, and then I get to bring all that stuff into the classroom, and that's what really energizes the kids. The experience, the deep research that I do, that I bring to the classroom, and certainly I can charge you with the same thing I charge my students. It's a republic if we can keep it. And our job as citizens of this great country is to research our history that we do here, the DAR. My sister-in-law, Patrice, a member of, and I've seen all the work she does to help keep history alive with the Lafayette information, which I'm fascinated by as well. But at the end of the day, it's our job to know our history, just like the student had said about me. It's our job to know our history, to then understand that history, that arc of freedom that America has brought here for all walks of life. To understand that history is to also understand that we are not a perfect nation. We have this nation that was born in slavery. One of our founding fathers is writing the words, "All men are created equal." We didn't give women the right to vote until 1919, but the arc of freedom is constantly pushing forward. So, ask yourself, what arc of freedom can we press on? I'll give you one other thing from Ben Franklin, then I'll get off the stage. I'm sorry. Sometimes you give a history teacher a microphone and it's a big mistake. But Ben Franklin said he often wondered about the chair that was in front of him in Constitution Hall. It had the backing, it had a sun half on the horizon. And he said, I often wondered if this is a setting sun or a rising sun. And he goes, I like to think it's the latter, that rising sun. I like to think that the United States is still that ladder. It's still that rising sun, that arc of freedom that will continue. We have our bumps, and America certainly right now is in a massive, great divide. But I firmly believe if organizations like the DAR, history teachers like myself, and citizens like you that you wouldn't be here. Of course, a lot of you are my family, so thank you for that. But many of the history folk that I saw out there and that are in this room, you're doing your job. You're teaching the history by being impressed by it and then passing it on to the youth. And I can think of no greater value to our country than to keep that history alive and to explain that it's important so that we can maintain that rising sun that Ben Franklin saw in the back of the chair. So one last time, thank you so much for this honor. Really appreciate it. And, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Maddie.
Thank you so much. And I wish I would have had a history teacher like Mr. Berner when I was in school, but thank you so much for coming, and what an impressive career he's had and continues to have for all of us. Thank you. Thank you.
Can we get a picture with the chapter numbers?
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, especially those of you who are here for the closing ceremony, because it's really meaningful to me, and it's, I think, meaningful to everybody on the committee. I'm going to introduce the Reverend Mel McGinnis, and he is pastor of the Kyneton Congregational Church. It's the oldest continuously, not continually, but actually continuously functioning church in Chautauqua County since 1815, founded by Revolutionary War veteran Reverend John Spencer, who was a very colorful character. And here he is, Reverend Mel McGinnis, for a closing prayer.
It's wonderful to be part of a rich heritage in Chautauqua County. How rich does it go? When you come to Kyneton and see the original 1815 Statement of Faith, that was written up by Roger Sherman, the only founding father to sign all four founding documents: the Articles of Confederation, the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Association, and the U.S. Constitution. Amazingly rich heritage we have here when you think the town of Carroll, named after Charles Carroll of Carrollton. Elbridge Gerry, named his name at Gary. Richard Stockton, the town of Stockton. When you think of Clymer, George Clymer. When you think of William Ellery, the town of Ellery. These individuals impacted our own county. When you think of the 250-year anniversary of the nation, you can't help but connect it with Chautauqua County. So as we go to prayer, you may know of a Revolutionary War figure who's buried in this county. If you do, during that time of prayer, just make the name be known. Appreciate Norm saying one, John Spencer. Do you know his grave is in this county as well? And you can spot it. Where is it again, Norm?
Sheridan.
Sheridan, yes.
Mel, if you'll permit me, I just have to interject here.
Yeah.
You know, Reverend Spencer was the first pastor at the first church structure built in the town of Bustye, right across the corner from where I live. And he would come down from Sheridan, and he may have stayed the night in my house.
No, wow!
Repeatedly.
That's how cool is that? All right. Very good. Well, let's just have a moment of silence here. And if you happen to know a Revolutionary War figure go ahead and just say the name out loud.
John Pickard.
Thank you, Lord, for a moment to pause in this silence to recollect names that give us what we have here today. Certainly, the names of our founding fathers still are retained in our memory, but to hear these names, these unknown ones, in this moment is very appropriate and fitting for us to do. Here, we recognize the inheritance that we have. Here, we recall the rich history of this county. Thank you, God, for the kind of heritage that we have. And may we be thankful for those who preserve it. Thank you for those who came today. And pray that people will understand the significance and importance of what was done here today. Thank you for Norm, Andrew, and all those who made this possible, and for all those in the county who are intricately involved with preserving this history. May it continue to be done throughout the years. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you very much, Mel, and thank you, everybody. And come back again if we have this, when we have this next year.